Hello, everybody. I would like to welcome you all at the beginning of this final session of the conference, Defining Architectural Quality, titled From City to Detail. As previous three sessions, we will start with a brief introductory remarks, followed by the keynote lecture by Professor Raul Malhotra, titled, excuse me for the pronunciation, I'm probably wrong, but thank you. Architecture in a Time of Flux. Then after the 40 minutes lecture, we will have half an hour for the discussion, then 10 minutes break. And after the break, we will start with the second part of our session, consisting of two presentations. First, the paper is going to be presented by Eric Belling, titled Detailing Quality, Relational Thought Across Scales in Architecture. Then the paper will be followed by 10 minutes for discussion, and then we will proceed to the second paper by Priyanka Salunke and Naomi Mehta, Architecture Beyond Form. After the second paper, we will have then 10 minutes for questions and answers, and then Wilfried is going to bring us an overview with the synthesis and the key points for our roundtable discussion. And after the roundtable discussion, we will have some time for concluding remarks, which will also include announcement for possible topics for the next conference, as kind of tracing possible fields or topics of interest, of relevance. So if you allow me, I would now start with some introductory remarks for this session. Prepared. While there is a broad consensus on the premise that we need an integrated approach to understanding architecture nowadays, it can prove difficult to define what we mean by the quality of architecture. In the present moment of global crisis, characterized by growing conflicts of interest and the need to define acceptable quality, it becomes even more evident that questions of architectural quality are rarely evaluated. Although there is neither universally applicable tool nor technique to define a set of values comparable to the evolving legacy of, like, first things first manifesto by designers, actual for last 4 or even more decades, the essential characteristics commonly ascribed to quality in architecture are still beauty, aesthetic honesty, wholeness, style, usefulness, all of which put forward form as a core and formal analysis as a theoretical approach to examine the presumed quality of architecture. The overarching implications is that the constitutive components of architectural quality can be identified by seeing, comparison and interpretation of its elements and the integrity of the whole. Yet, the question how these elements are integrated into their context proves that particular project, building, or urban plan is not good in itself, while its characteristics considered to be qualities in one surrounding can be easily become inappropriate to another place, climate, or cultural tradition. Analogous to this, sustainable architecture can take the role previously played by modernist architecture in deconstruction of urban fabric. Thus, quality in architecture and urban design is understood as an open concept, specific to its site and cultural context, built on knowledge and at the same time generating the debate about the evaluation. The intention of this session is to propose reflections on the concept of quality of architecture and the context of integrated approach from city to detail, including both general and specific issues. Starting from the premise that the quality of architecture is not an absolute category, the one that can be prescribed in advance, The methodological framework is the contextual analysis of the multi-layered relations of part to the whole. To introduce new viewing positions, these relationships are examined in different scales, linked to measurable parameters and specific characteristics of environment, changing its meaning in different cultural, social, political, or environmental contexts. By shifting attention away from the structuralist approach focused on architecture as language and its complex meaning to exploring the relational dimension of architecture, the proposed concept is theorized as place value. Therefore, the materiality of architecture in specific cultural and physical contexts can be evaluated by giving an account of the place quality, linked to the experience of space, the presence or absence of atmosphere, dependent on the perception of the space, sensations, and sentiments. By taking the critical distinction of architectural quality as a starting point, contributions to architectural discourse may be made in projects, buildings, urban plans, statements, as well as other media of representation. Instead of canonizing categories, recent inquiry in architectural theory focused on rethinking the canon is closely linked with the current focus on examining architecture as a process situated within the expanded field of architectural relations. I thank you for your attention, and I would like to call Wilfried to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Raúl Mejota.
Thank you, Jasna, and thank you for co-chairing this session. I have the great honor and privilege of introducing Raúl Mejota, whom I have known for some years, though have met only occasionally, unfortunately. I couldn't think of anyone better to be the last keynote lecturer but Raúl, because he is in many ways able to synthesize from urban design to architecture and all the other questions associated with that implementation of urban design plans and architecture that we've talked about in the last sessions. You will see that he has that capacity intellectually and in terms of design, something that's very rare in contemporary architecture, that people are both theoretically astute as well as talented designers. And so just a few words about Raúl. He is the founder of RMA Architects, and he divides his time, which I think must be quite difficult, between his office in Mumbai and teaching in Cambridge, Massachusetts, because he's the professor of urban design and planning, the John T. Dunlop Professor in Housing and Urbanization there. So that must be an enormously demanding job. He is well known for his writings on things in his region, from Bombay to India, and therefore he has shown this comprehensive knowledge of both the history of architecture as well as the history of urban design in India. There has been a research book project which was carried through in Harvard University called the Kumbh Mela, Mapping the Ephemeral Megacity. And that's essentially led him to work on the topic on which he's going to focus in his presentation, the kinetic city. So we welcome Raúl. Please, Raúl, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Wilfried. Let me just share my screen and then we'll start here. Oh, sorry. No. This is not working. Why is this not working? I'm sharing. No. Okay. Okay. It is. Thank you. Great. Super. Thank you very much. And thank you for this invitation to what sounds like an easy, but it's an extremely difficult topic, and has been interesting to kind of think through. Thank you again, Wilfred, for your kind words, and actually, you know, the way you've set it up, it makes me very nervous, but I'm going to try. Thank you again. And thank you, you know, it's just lovely to see many familiar faces and people I haven't seen for a long time. So thank you just for this invitation. So I just in response to the provocation, I call this talk Context Matters, but I have a subtitle, which is Architecture in a Time of Flux, a kind of a context that one is trying to discern. And what I'm going to do is really speak from the perspective of a practitioner. And I'm going to kind of break this presentation into three parts. One, the first section is called the context of the context, which is really sharing with you my own attempts at discerning the context I work in. And I call it the context of the context because it's an imaginary of nestling the obvious parameters of a context within perhaps more ambitious readings. The second is I'm just going to reflect very quickly on your provocation. And the third is I'm going to show two projects to make that bridge to architecture, to see how this understanding might help us respond, and where, you know, because we've all, I think, in these various sessions recognized that there are multiple ways of reading quality. And I hope these two projects, which one chose carefully with Wilfred's help a little bit, just to pose kind of opposite parameters that help us or push us to imagine quality with different parameters. So, you know, as an architect, I think, or as architects, the idea of the context is something we've traditionally understood as the broader physical environment of a given site, the comprehension which is extended through wider parameters such as climate, culture, and, you know, when we are ambitious, embedded histories, excavating embedded histories. But is this reading potent and dynamic enough for designers to understand the world in which they intervene? If not, how does an architect construct the appropriate narratives for the imagining of architecture and the built environment at large? The urban geographer, Neil Brenner, proposes that by nestling the context in its context, we can potentially create more nuanced and productive readings of our sites of interventions. Meta-narratives clarifying the context in which the context of our operation sits is a useful instrument, perhaps, to imagine a precise range of potential interventions for architects and other design professionals. This is then the space where design intersects with its broader social, political, economic, and cultural landscape. Brenner describes these meta-narratives across a range of emergent conditions. One such family of narratives that fundamentally challenge our forms of engagement as designers is that of contemporary rapid geo-economic integration and even spatial development. Inequity will be the biggest issue we all know we'll face in the next decades. For evidence of this, one need not look further than the shifting demographies at the national global scales, and particularly the upswing of the movement of people given the effects and the implications of climate change, which is clearly linked in many ways to inequality. And it, of course, presents a whole host of challenges for architects and planners. And, you know, in the discussion yesterday, the word majority world came up. I was listening to the conversation earlier, the global north-south. These are categories that are, well, especially the global north and south is getting completely deconstructed. In fact, the rubric of the majority world is much more productive today because, as defined by the photographer from Bangladesh who called it, where I used the term for a photography biennale, implying where a majority of the world resides, and the implications for design with that mismatch between GDP and the density of people, which is broadly what geographically we call the global north and south, although that's getting fuzzy, becomes a much more productive category, because from these contexts comes the question of the remaking of political identities, urbanization of poverty, and of course, new claims to citizenship. And this squarely leads us to narratives of state reconstruction under neoliberalization and the notion of simultaneous transitions in the city and in the broader landscape that historian Yves Blau, a colleague here of mine, has articulated in the context of Eastern Europe. According to Blau, these transitions occur over decades, evolving from one set of protocols and values into new ideological systems that are often not as stable as one might expect or imagine. Extending from this discourse are questions pertaining to the role of the state and the agency of planning and design relative to new forms of democracy developing around the world. NGOs, civil society, and rapidly changing modes of patronage each have renewed roles in the making of the built environment in these transitions. And Blau argues, and to quote her, transitions has clear implications for architecture and urban design. It is a condition that foregrounds practice and enables architecture to play an active performative role in the formation of the city, end quote. So through this reading, it is evident that the context in its context lies at an intersection between the sensual and the political, as well as between form of design and societal culture. This is where a productive overlap, I believe, between the spheres of our concerns and the spheres of our direct influence occurs. As architects, we are aware of and concerned with many issues, from societal through planetary scales, and ranging from poverty and public health to urban violence and climate change. More often than not, our sphere of influence does not empower us to address any of these issues in a tangible manner. Across the design profession, the frustration tied to our attempts to engage these problems is palpable. The cynicism comes from that. Thus, by articulating narratives of sight, using the methods of examining the context in its context, we discover that our spheres of concern, the context of the context, can actually be acted upon from within our spheres of influence, our more immediate context, and vice versa, each nourished and clarified by the other. Most importantly, these narratives illuminate the narrow circumscription of architects' territory of operation in the business as usual model of practice. It also sheds light on ways to better understand the site as mediated through and embedded within a larger scale of economic, social, and political processes. Through this broader scope, designers can potentially have a far-reaching progressive social impact beyond the immediate sites of our projects. And so this sort of clarification, and then the subtitle, which was Time of Flux, I want to just sort of position that, because for me, it as a practitioner, it becomes a way, when I was sort of describing the spheres of concern and the spheres of influence, because they are growing exponentially, we're concerned with every issue, our influence is diminishing. And I think it is actually up to us to construct the narratives which give us agency, because the narratives connect us to the instruments that we can use, so to speak. And so I think the notion of flux is an important one within this larger embedded conversation on climate change, because we're living through particularly transitional times. And this again speaks to the idea of transitions. And yet architecture has not been sufficiently responsive to these processes of change. It has attempted actually to stall or interrupt them without translating the energies of transitions into concepts and forms that are generative and productive, in a sense, to make livable futures. The practice of architecture has been obsessed with permanence and stability through imagining absolute solutions. And I mean, I don't think it's a question of one or the other, but that absolutism is the dangerous thing, creating good, stable architecture and even conveying permanence, because as human beings, we need the stability of permanence, albeit illusionary. It is the absolutism in the solutions that are problematic in a moment of transitions. And to make the shift to transitionary thinking would mean recognizing the interconnectedness as well as the unpredictability of social, economic, political, and natural systems to address problems at all levels of the spatio-temporal scale in ways that could make life on our planet sustainable. But it most importantly implies renouncing a business as usual rhetoric by embracing the modesty of the light, reversible, and becoming intensely more centered on equitable relationships between humankind, the natural environment, the multi-species planet that we sort of inhabit. And I think it has severely degraded at great cost to its own future as species, which is human beings. And so architectures of transition implies the simultaneous validity of modes of engagement, as well as transgressions and synergies between disparate disciplinary cultures and modes of representation, knowledge accumulation, as well as production. It means walking the dangerously razor-thin line between polarized conditions to challenge and manifest their redundancies as imagined binaries. It requires unsettling the relevance of the static permanent manifestation of architecture as the singular spectacle of organizing the city. It is a very critical spectacle and instrument to organize the city, but we've got to get away from the fact that it is the singular one. And I think here, it's again, I go back to this notion of the sphere of concern and influence becomes very important, because I think the quality of architecture resides at this intersection. It's a more kind of, I guess, nuanced way of expanding the context to place ourselves in this intersection in more ambitious way. But it also means getting away from the binaries that help us organize the world. Binaries are it's a wonderful way to organize the world, albeit simplistic, but how do we kind of blur these binaries? Because they're really non-productive, because it forces us to live in one or the other world. So we become architects of the formal city or the informal city, or we are working with the state and I think we could be doing all of this simultaneously. And the blurring of binaries, the synthetic quality of the synthesis, which is integral and inherent and really fundamental in what we do, I think can be instrumentalized here. And therefore, here we come to the notion of modes of engagement. And this is where I'd like to, picking up on Wilfred's very kind introduction, place my own practice or my own engagement, which is a combination and sitting at the intersection between practice, research, theory, pedagogy, and advocacy. And each one of these, this is, one could do a talk just on this, but the feedback loops, the circularity, between these, which is theory can be constructed both through reflecting on practice, advocacy, and pedagogy becomes a way to do that, founded on research, is I think how we position, at least I would position or explain, the practice. And so with that, I'm going to share with you 2 or 3 research projects, again, things that Wilfred sort of alluded to. And again, these are, let me say, it always feels clumsy because these are very disparate parts. But what I wanted to share with you is just fragments of how this modes of engagement through research at different scales, what I sort of refer to as the nestling of scales, because again, by nestling scales, you create the kind of intersections that I was alluding to between our spheres of concern and influence. And one project, and I'm starting at least a larger scale within the context of India and South Asia, is just asking the question, what is urban? Because, there is a whole shift that's occurring here. In India, there are 3 criteria that we use to define what might qualify as a town or as urban. One is a population of 5,000 people, a density of 400 people per square kilometer, and the fact that over 75% of the male population is in non-agricultural employment. Now, this is a very bizarre category that comes from colonial practices and ways of organizing the rural and urban, because it is about constructing that binary. And, for some reason, it's yet sort of used. And based on that, India looks like this, which is 7,523 towns. They're broken by class. being defined as a town allows you to get infrastructure, funding, a municipality, all of that. But actually, if I took those three criteria and deconstructed them, which means I used only a criteria at a time to understand what is urban India, I get a completely different reading of urban India. So if I use the first criteria, 5,000 people, that's what urban India looks like. And you see the density in Kerala, in the southern parts of India, along the parts of the Indo-Gangetic Plain. If I took the census criteria of 400 people per square kilometer, 400 people per square kilometer is a high density. Greater Houston is 240. You get the world's biggest megacity sitting in the Indo-Gangetic Plain. It's continuous urbanization, 200 miles wide and about 1,500 miles long. So it is the world's biggest megacity, and you see a different formation of what might be the urban. If I took the criteria of 75% of the male population, the megacity disappears because everyone there is also doing agriculture. And so you have a complete blur there between the urban and the rural. But what this indicates, and this will hopefully be a book by the end of the year, what it indicates is about 200 plus million people are going back and forth on a seasonal flux. And that has huge implications in the way we should be imagining cities, the way we should be talking about housing and the formation of housing, the typologies of housing, which is all centered on the nuclear family as an essential assumption. And so that kind of reading deconstructs architecture in its imaginary because the needs are completely different. And so what our thesis is that there are about almost now 15,000 transitioning settlements. These are settlements that are not urban, they're not rural, which means they have all the characteristics of the urban, where urban livelihoods are emerging within rural morphologies. And these face a greater deficit in terms of civic amenities, but are often not in a fiscal position to implement highly engineered solutions, even if they manage to establish smart governance structures. These settlements may not have the demands revenue base that justifies sewage treatment plants or captive power plants. Even standard urban amenities like piped water supply, toilets connected to piped water conveyance are hard to implement in these settlements that have grown organically. The question is, what will these settlements look like? What can designers do here? Is the urban form and aesthetic of these cities also embedded critical questions of values, political ideologies? The challenge is how we shift our gaze to see this as a continuous urban ecology, or to use Richard Sennett's description, an open system or network of flows. And imagine what this will look like and what different physical forms it will take becomes the role of architecture. Will these look and operate like villages or cities? Or will small transitioning towns have its own urban form logic, relationship to the rural hinterland? Things we have to speculate about, as the spatial and the architectural questions here will be very critical. So this is a kind of gaze at, or look at, or research at, this sort of national level. And when this sort of flux lands on the ground, that's what it looks like. And even here, the categories of the formal and the informal make no sense, because informality as a notion emanated in economics, informal economies. The people you see here that you might attribute to the informal city are actually largely employed in the formal economy. And many of the guys you see living in what you call the formal city are employed in the informal economy. And so there's a complete reversal. Images and categorization within the binaries that I was critiquing don't make much sense. And so for me, the framing of this phenomena under the rubric or what I call the temporal landscapes, ephemeral urbanism, or more specifically, the kinetic city, is a much more inspirational category than the informal city, for it implies the transitionary rather than the transformative or the absolute. This is an urbanism created by those outside the elite domains of the formal modernity of the state. It is what the Indian scholar Ravi Sundaram refers to as a pirate modernity that slips under the laws of the city to simply survive without any conscious attempt at constructing a counterculture. Here, architecture is not even the single spectacle of the city. Instead, festivals and other fora complement architecture as the spectacle of the city. Festivals, for example, allow the subaltern to create a forum for self-expression, both cultural and political. And the example here of the Ganesh festival is pertinent, because here, about 200-300 idols, sometimes of that scale, get immersed on the last day after 10 days of celebration. And immersion becomes a metaphor for the spectacle of the city, because as the clay idol dissolves in the water of the bay, the spectacle comes to a close. There are no static or permanent mechanisms to encode the spectacle. Here, the memory of the city is an enacted process, a temporal moment, as opposed to buildings that contain the public memory as static or permanent entities. This phenomenon of flux is critical to these cities and nations being connected to the global economy. However, the spaces it creates has been largely excluded from the cultural discourse on globalization, which has focused on elite domains of production in the city. It is what I'm referring to is not the city of the poor or the regular models of the formal and informal city and other such binaries, but it is the kinetic space, a space where these models collapse into singular entities in space, where meanings are shifting and blurred. And the kinetic city obviously cannot be seen as a design tool, rather a demand that conceptions of urbanism create and facilitate environments that are versatile, flexible, robust, and ambiguous enough to allow this kinetic quality to flourish, albeit in a transitionary spirit within a maybe tighter temporal frame. So this is quite opposite to where architecture is the central instrument for the city. I call this the landscape of impatient capital. Capital is intrinsically impatient, but when it lands on certain terrains that don't provide it fictions, the friction, the Dubais, the Shanghais of the world, you get architecture, which is I call it an architecture of desperation, where architects twist and turn these buildings just to catch attention. It is capital that drives its temporal scale, because it has to be built very quickly to realize its value. And so the idea of the kinetic city, one expanded through this research into what one has referred to as ephemeral urbanism. Kinetic became ephemeral, city became urbanism. And it expands the rubric theoretically to more broadly address this issue. And the argument is clearly not to pose yet another form of urbanism, but to argue of its inherent value in supplementing the static city. It's not about one or the other. It is just recognizing and infecting the debate which has instrumentalized architecture singularly to be really enriched and more encompassing, but also a phenomena that is part of this expanded field of understanding the current state of urbanism globally. I mean, yesterday's keynote touched upon this in such beautiful and poetic ways. Basically, to identify it as one more strain of urban reading and practice that could be instrumental for both practitioners as well as for reflection for the urban designer on the ground. The assumption that permanence is a default condition or a single instrument to imagine our cities is limiting, as we often designing permanent solutions for temporary needs. And I think that provocation is a critical one. And so this was a project that had the provocation, does permanence matter? It's a book which also got translated into exhibitions. And here we developed, just to very briefly tell you about this, a taxonomy, because even this can't be very singular. So the taxonomy we developed was ephemeral landscapes for transaction, religion, strife, extraction, celebration, refugee, military. These all have completely different temporal scales. They have completely different protocols. And for designers to be inspired or even intervene in them, the parameters and the protocols, as I said, are completely different. And this led to, again, what Wilfred referred to was the project of the Kumbh Mela, which was called Mapping the Ephemeral Megacity, because it is an ephemeral megacity. This is a city that is set up every 12 years and in smaller cycles of 4 years. To house 7 million people for 55 days in India. And it has about 120 visitors. The Harvard research, a certain 97 cell phones visited the Kumbh Mela. So you could easily say over 100 million people came here over 5 days of very particular religious sort of ceremonies. It was an interdisciplinary project, which was, I think, my first learning and exposure to the notion that interdisciplinarity like this works when no one discipline completely privileges its knowledge on a question. And this was a case where you had to map an ephemeral megacity, and really no one, not even the architects, felt any confidence to enter the problem or what to expect. And it's a city that sits at the confluence of the Ganges and the Yamuna next to the city of Allahabad. This is a satellite image during the monsoon. When the waters recede in October, the sandbanks appear and the site for the city is exposed, on which the city is built. So what you see in white with the grid is the city, and the white is the sandbank. So it's the lightest city in the world. It's the lightest megacity in the world, and it disappears in 55 days. And it's constructed in 6 to 8 weeks, because the site only appears at the end of in the middle of October. And by the middle of January, they actually are operating. So which means, well, 3 months really, but it's 2 months of actual construction before the site is prepared. That's a before and after image from the same spot. And you see in, the top image I took in September. And when we went back on the 15th of January, that's what we saw from the same spot. A whole city was constructed on an incredibly robust grid. Now, there are many things about the city, again, a lecture in itself, but a few learnings that are important. One is it's a kit of parts. It's the entire the entire superstructure of the city is built in 5 materials, which you see here. And that sort of goes up. That 8-foot bamboo module is ramped up all the way to large temples. And it's quite incredible, because that's what makes it be deployed so quickly and dismantled so quickly, because at the end of 55 days, all that's left are the thatch mats, and the city is actually dismantled in 2 weeks, and a lot of the material recycled. And that's what the city looks like when it's on a very robust grid. Every street goes across on a pontoon bridge, but then when it disappears, it leaves no memory except the etching of that grid. But this is a formal, intentional, and deliberate state operation. Now, this is not a pop-up or an informal city. And that's where the categories of those binaries confuse us, because there's an aesthetic bias to what we call also the informal city. And extending that, I think, again, the research, what I call instruments of advocacy. So these are books we've done on Mumbai. They range all the way from, meta-narratives and histories of the city to walking tours, because these are instruments to facilitate conservation of buildings. One values values architecture, but also the stability of the city. So I don't want to be misunderstood that we are making a proposition for temporary cities only, but we are merely saying that one must recognize how that can complement the static city. And this work led to, creating urban legislation. This was the first urban conservation legislation in the country, which we, lobbied for in 1995. And it was based on a lot of this research. The books gave us a kind of voice and instrumentality within the city as professionals, because if we don't have that, then I think we are not relevant as professionals. But also the interest in documenting architecture, book on architecture, where one tried to unpack what were the emerging models of practice that were happening in India, because we've looked at India largely through the lens of modernism or modernity, or our post-independence modernity. And the greatest scholar who's done that is on the screen with us. But there were many other emergent forms that existed there. One found there were large temples being built, which were now the contemporary architecture. So one tried to dig deeper in this book to understand what's driving that. Although my practice, I think, would easily fall within the kinds of rubrics and is inspired greatly by the construction of the context that, Professor Curtis here has brilliantly, narrated. In fact, the last thing I did graduating was to do a course with him, which equipped me to go back and not be confused by what was defined as critical regionalism and all of that, and really practiced in that genre. But I really was intrigued by the alternate practices, the counter-modernism, everything that surrounded us. I felt like we were the minority in our practice. And so this book was really about unpacking and understanding what sort of lay below all of that. And it took the forms of exhibitions, because again, these are instruments of advocacy, exhibitions on the state of architecture, the state of housing. So this is, I'm showing all of this because I really see this as part of the practice, the production of books, or what I call instruments of advocacy. This is where pedagogy, research, advocacy, and practice begin to create these intersections within which one can place oneself to understand the context of the context. And so it's very integral to the practice and in the making of architecture. And these have culminated in two recent books, which have, one captures 30 years of reflection of our practice, and one 30 years of reflection on writing and what that meant. And now I come to the second part. I'll move through this very quickly. How much more time do I have, Wilfred? If someone can just give me a sense.
You have until until the full hour, so 20 minutes.
Oh, super. I'll be done. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Then I can even take a sip of my tea. Thank you. So I then want to, in the second part, in the third part, I'll share two projects. But in the second part, I just want to, reflect on your provocation, which was interesting, difficult, seemingly simple, but incredibly difficult and very slippery. It's not an easy one to get on. And I followed all the keynotes, and different people picked it up differently, which were all, in my view, simultaneously valid. This is what's so confusing about a rubric like this, but productive, I think. And so, this is a provocation you put, and I really think it is a combination of all of these. And that's why I highlighted your last sentence. But it is about the quality in design, which is connected to values, and therefore what are values? Because values have a temporal quality and a dimension, because values change. Like identity is not a found category. We construct our identity every day. And that's why sometimes it's a mistake to go back and try to excavate identity, because all of these identity value have temporal dimensions. And therefore quality in architecture appears to be fundamentally a concept that's obviously subject to a wide range of interpretations, and understanding of the context and its context, I believe, is critical, because that intersection is what, in reflecting to your provocation, I concluded was where we should go. So that's just a very brief reflection to tie the part that I've just finished and the part that I'm just going to enter. The second section, I'm going to enter this through adding another dimension to the parameters for quality, which is the notion of the client, which we also look at in very singular terms. And if you unpack the client, just for simplicity, one can nuance it in incredibly beautiful and productive ways. But let me just say, there's a patron client, there's an operational client, and there's a user client. The patron client, so let me say, in a single family house, invariably, these collapse into one entity, and we have a unified client. Sometimes it's a couple and you have some differences, but those are very, very minor. Whereas if I'm doing a university project, the patron client could be the university president, and the president and the patron client often is defining the vision, the aspiration, and also holds the money bags. The operation client in a university campus, let me use that situation, is the campus architect or engineer who's pragmatic, who's trying to deliver on time, who is restraining the budgets. And the user clients would be the students and faculty. We tend to align with one of these clients if we want to be pragmatic, or we want to be aspirational, or we want to be over democratic. Of course, a good project means trying to get all of these three on the same table, on the same side of the table. And I think that's what also can make good architecture in terms of process. And of course, it's not always easy. It's sometimes very difficult. But I mean, I think that is another parameter, because all those define what might set the context for you to create that architecture. So I'm going to now just sort of share with you two of our projects. And I selected these, like I said, in discussion with Wilfred, because I was, it could be many things. But I chose two that actually respond and actually also, I think, attempt to understand architectural quality by expanding the notion to value, worth, responsibility to society, what labor practices might mean, what social economic justice could mean, ways of making, questions of relevance. I mean, I think one can take quality and nuance it in many ways. And I tried to take slightly diametric projects, one where architectural integrity was very critical and therefore materiality and everything that extends from that. And the second project I've taken is one where it's a much more complex process. It really it was about negotiating, and part of the process was bringing the clients on the same page. And it was imaginary where one moved beyond or did not privilege architecture as the instrument for defining this, but what an armature of life might look like. And that second project I'm going to show you is also about a kind of multi-species articulation of a living environment. So this first project was at CEPT University. This is a building that might be familiar to all of you. It's the School of Architecture designed by Doshi in the late 60s. And it's a whole campus that has evolved over 3 or 4 decades. We were approached to design a library for them. It was a very difficult project because it was also where I studied. What was also really challenging was that the entire building committee, the operational client, not the patron client, was people who had been 5 to 10 years senior to me in the school. So they always talked down to me, sometimes in very productive ways. It was also going to be the first building that wasn't designed by Doshi. So of course that set up a whole hornet's sort of nest politically. So it was just a very difficult project to intervene in. Given that the master plan, which was made by someone else, actually demanded a 6-story building on the site, which would have killed the campus. I mean, I just couldn't imagine doing something like that. And so that's roughly what the campus looks like. The site we were given was a predetermined site. We had very little control on that. These are some of the existing buildings, and our intervention made it central because the campus actually is expanded on either side, which is not visible in this site plan. But it also meant it was a wide constituency, again, clients, it was the students and faculty that had to be engaged in it. It was the building committee, which was the operational client, and one was fortunate to also have some access to the patron clients in this case because one studied in Ahmedabad and knew people. And so it became a very interesting, I mean, the notion of deconstructing the client actually came from reflecting about these 2 projects. I didn't go into these 2 projects saying these are different clients. I was just trying to get everyone on the same page. Anyway, that's where the building was located on the site. And what was, a parameter I set for myself was that this building would respect every inch of the datums that the Doshi buildings create. As someone who also works in conservation, I felt that was something that I would not compromise on. So it basically meant the building had to go 3 floors below the ground to make the program work and yet be respectful in a way that it wouldn't mimic the buildings that are already existing on the campus, but also sit in terms of form and what it does on the campus in ways that would, add quality, I suppose, to the overall urban form. Now, it's not for me to judge whether that's successful or not, but that was the aspiration and the constraints. And what you see there is the model that I've took for the first presentation, which I only opened the side of the model halfway through the presentation when everyone was convinced there was no way that a 3-story building would have the program, and surprised them that I was going into the basement, which then, of course, had its own challenges. And what we came up was an idea where it was, again, these 3 scales of buildings nestled into each other, which were programmatically different. The outer skin was a performative one, which modulated the climate. The one that was inside, which is the box that you see with the articulated openings, was a dry wall that just contained everything within. So if we needed air conditioning on the upper levels, it could contain the air. And what you see as the third component is the book stacks. each of these buildings had their own logic. The sectional logic of the first outer skin was 4 meters or 4.5 meters. The logic of the next level was 3.2 meters, and the sectional logic of the bookcases, which was treated as a building in itself, was 2.4 meters, because 8 feet you can reach a book with a very, very small stool, so it's comfortable to do that. And so each of these buildings had a completely different sectional logic. And they sat within this sort of pit with a series of courtyards that were carved out to bring light down to the lowest level. I mean, not enough light to read necessarily, but just the sense that you knew it was dark and day and the light sort of streamed down. The outer skin was constructed in reinforced concrete, and everything that was above was a steel and drywall construction. The louvers were made in plywood, which were treated, but this was all because of course, the constraints also of cost. And many of these components, one recognized, had material life cycles which could be modulated and changed over time, whereas the essential DNA of the building, which needed to be stable, was in reinforced concrete. To create that stability. Of course, this has thermal advantages of cooling, but it really was a response to the integrity of the urban form. And this is how it sits above the ground. This is a facade, it's a base in exposed concrete, and the louvers, which are all operatable in these different panels. So there are many permutations and combinations by which one can set it to modulate light. You can open one panel, you can angle the panel. Each panel has 6 settings of angles so that it can be really nuanced in terms of how light is modulated. And that's how it sits in the campus. It maintains all the datums. It also picks up the plinth. So now it also becomes like a platform for that open space to set up the building and give it the prominence of a library. It has a series of layers where it's ambiguous, both the space, this is what is in the white space on the right is what's controlled in terms of climate. The rest is all naturally ventilated and can be adjusted. And it sort of creates an extension of the plaza. And here you see it cut into the ground. The concrete gets lighter to establish the datum. So by the time it gets down to the lowest level, it's a much lighter concrete. So it reflects the light in more substantial ways. The ground floor now it's being used for exhibitions a lot, but it was supposed to be an ambiguous space, a space people could walk through to connect to different parts of the campus. In plan, it kind of has the reference to Fatehpur Sikri, where there are 3 bridges which establish the different accesses on the campus, and it was supposed to be an ambiguous space, but suddenly it's become very popular for exhibitions, so there's always an exhibition. So it's lost some of its ambiguity, but hopefully they'll have another space for exhibition soon because there's a big demand, and it'll go back to this kind of ambiguous democratic space for students to use. But this is the different layers of the building as you see them. The bridges connect, separate, create these thresholds. They're soft thresholds because you come through very ambiguous space into what is otherwise an ambiguously defined ground floor. Here you see it in use as an exhibition, so it's a little more kind of formalized. And as you go to the upper floors, it's much lighter. I'm sorry, as you go to the lower floors, I'll do that first. The concrete here you see gets whiter as you go down, so the reflection and the luminosity sorts of increase. This is within the building at the lower level, which are the carrels, the reading rooms. And here you get a sense that because of the slippage in section, you get these extended diagonal views because the sections of all those 3 buildings are very different. So you don't feel you're in a sandwich going down into a basement, but it's very luminous and porous and transparent because your eyes go at a diagonal and you see courtyards, you see natural light, you see artificial light, and all of that simultaneously. And you see the pigment on the wall at the lower levels is even lighter. And as you sort of, sectionally see the building, there are these catwalks to operate the louvers. The catwalk on the lower level is on the outside, which also serves as a water gutter. And you see the 2 skins of the building, so to speak, the bridge that connects these to different points on the campus. and then the lower level with these skylights that actually take light down even further into the basement. And so at the lowest level, that's 3 floors down, you two floors down, you get this. And then what is within that white box is the bookcases, which again have their own logic. So you have these half levels and carrels along the edge. But the half levels take you up to different parts of that big bookcase. It's like a big walk-in wardrobe of books. And the lowest level, it has just these 3 portals. There are no columns. The 3 portals define the structure, and all the services are integrated in the book stack. So this is left very raw and monastic. And when the portals intersect, you get these rooms for quieter reflection. And so it picks up this sort of quality of starkness, let's say, at the lowest sort of levels. And when you go up to the upper levels, it's much more luminous. They're reading rooms. These louvers, as I said, can be adjusted so people can control light. We also created a manual for the school. It's unfortunately not been made so operational. My ambition was there would be a class that would map the climate for the building. And this is in 2 languages, which tells you what are the optimum settings for every panel on the facade for different seasons. So light and the thermal quality, and we felt students could learn from it. There's students who've individually done this and consulted us, but I was hoping there'd be a course on climate, which might begin to actually map the building. And at night, it kind of regains a different kind of presence because it becomes more luminous as the lights emerge within, and everything else goes into shadow and profile. And the base of the building is articulated actually as otlas or seats. And, you know, I have hundreds of images of kids having lunch here, studying, using laptops, working. So the whole base of the building gets really occupied, and sitting there, you can look down. There are no railings. We put glass, which is separated from the sides, so the air is not interrupted, but you can look into the building, but it also reflects the outside. And at night, like I said, it begins to take on a completely different presence. So this project, as you saw, I mean, architecture is very central as the instrument. It was about trying to respect through a broader understanding and histories of what the campus was and how one could respect it. Of course, the process was very, very complicated, whether it should be brick and exposed concrete. And finally, the decision by the administrators was that we should also find ways that we can also demonstrate the use of other contemporary materials that exist, because, you know, it's not going to be easy to use those materials, always. The second project is a much more complex project. These are my clients. This was a competition we won in the city of Jaipur to design homes for elephants and their mahouts. The mahouts are largely from the Muslim community in a Hindu, right-wing Hindu extreme state, almost Rajasthan. This was a very complex problem. There was a chief minister who instituted the competition, which also had its very interesting history over decades. But in any case, it was a low cost or housing for low income. It was also very low cost, but it was housing for low income, which means the constraints are immense. The government stipulates they can't have more than 350 square feet. You got to have a beast like this, a lovely beast like this, live there. You see from the elephants' ears how their health is very bad. Elephants shouldn't be here. These are tropical beings. They should be in, tropical climates. That's why they thrive in Thailand, Sri Lanka, Kerala. This is a kind of a mistake of history, or not a mistake, but a fact of history that the Maharajas brought them here for pomp, celebration, battle, all of that. And here, one of the essays on inequity that I read by an Indian scholar called Pratap Bhanu Mehta is something I just want to read out because it kind of prefaces not the complexity, but I think it equipped me well to look at this project differently. I read this about halfway through the project where I was completely frustrated. I was ready to resign because anything I suggested was perversely undermined by the Public Works Department. Anyway, what Pratap Bhanu Mehta said in his issue on inequity to quote him, in a society riven by deep inequality, there's not even the minimal basis for mutual concern, where social distance makes human beings almost a different species in each other's eyes. Why would you expect anything else? Why would a contractor care if one of his construction workers used his hands rather than a brush to apply a dangerous chemical? The more inequality there is, the harder it is to imagine what it's like to be in someone else's shoes. It has to be admitted that even the most well-meaning and sensitive find it hard to imagine what the suffocation, darkness, and sheer physical suffering of being at the bottom of a societal hierarchy might be really like. The very thing you would expect to instigate questions of justice makes it harder to raise them. And this is what this whole project was about. It was a very complicated negotiation, which it took us 10 years to understand that our role was negotiating this with the government and the Public Works Department and making a habitat for these beings. And it was exhausting, but in reflection, it was incredibly satisfying. And here there was a reversal where architecture, we realized very quickly, could not be the instrument to have these negotiations. And so this is from the New York Times. When American tourists began to visit Jaipur, this is how they were set up to feel like Maharajas for a day. These animals, the elephants take tourists up and down the ramparts of the Amber. They're painted with these toxic colors. They go rogue. There have been cases where they've killed tourists in the summer because it's like 50 degrees centigrade. You can fry an egg on the street here. It's that hot. The housing the government gave them looked like this, where the elephants lived below, the mahouts lived on top. But very quickly, the mahouts all moved down and you see their beds. They started living there because the relationship between a mahout and an elephant is incredibly complex. They sing to the elephants. They have to really manage these beasts who can be dangerous. And so that relationship was very important, and this housing didn't work. And that was partly why the competition was floated. The site had been quarried by sand contractors and sand, people who sell sand because it's a lovely sand for exposed concrete. It's very dry in a desert climate. And that's the site we got. And of course, our metrics were all about water. Our analysis was all about water. And very quickly, we made it a landscape project. We felt if we couldn't have water there and we couldn't have a landscape that simulated comfort for these, for everyone dwelling there, again, like a multi-species project, it would not be a relevant project at all. And so, of course, we spent time structuring that. We had a good landscape consultant, Mohan Rao from Bangalore, who worked with us. We realized it was about creating a micromanagement system of micro dams to collect the water, to create water bodies. And really what we did was then put the housing in the interstitial spaces. So what we did was create the logic of landscape here, and the housing was situated in the interstitial spaces. The housing didn't command the logic for the site planning, so to speak. What's also interesting about this project is it's situated at a middle scale, talking about nestling scales and nestling concerns, where it was for very marginalized people, where landscape had to become the chief protagonist and orchestrate an environment. And so that became the final site plan. As you can see, the landscape was really the most prominent sort of organizing structure. What you see here is the site in March 2007 when we first went there. That hill is the same hill. 3 years later, that's what the site looked like. I mean, here what happened really was the Public Works Department just kept going with the building because that's where the money is, I suppose. We managed to get them to excavate a pond. Landscape wasn't in the tender and the government fell. So the site just lay fallow for 3 years. But in the process, the landscape generated. So when the new government came to power, we took them to site and we showed them what was possible, that they reinstated the project. And in 2017, 5 years ago, the same hills you see now, it's become a really thick landscape that protects the site in a sense, and the water too. Of course, we paid attention to the housing. We subverted the row housing the government wanted, which you see in the top diagram, and used the same areas to make cluster housing. There's enough precedence over the last 40 years to look at good housing. The 350 square feet, we introduced a courtyard at no cost. So the house suddenly expanded to 500 square feet. We put 3 houses in a big courtyard. So if the three families got on well, they had a mansion in a sense. If they didn't get on well, they at least had a much bigger house than they would get, and they could use the 500 square feet, sorry, of the terrace, because we did flat terraces. And also this notion the house could be added to, built. It was set up as a kind of DNA or a structure where it would keep the integrity of the site plan, but it could be malleable as a house. And it was very raw because it took 5 years for them to allocate homes. So I don't even have images of how the house has now become more malleable, which one should do soon. And of course, we use the logic of ventilation and how the food stored on these roofs for the elephants could be used to insulate. And that's the first phase. When things got built, you see a water body on the left, and you also see the ramparts of Amber where they go to work at the far end on the hill. And that's how far they walk to work, because for tourism. This is when we had just started finishing one phase of 4 clusters like this. And of course, the houses were just left unplastered because I felt that once people were allocated homes, they could paint, plaster. In Rajasthan, the crafts are fantastic. So these were like armatures or frameworks. The whole site was imagined as an armature for life to flourish, and the homes were also imagined as these robust armatures that were very malleable. People could add a thatch roof, they could add a concrete roof, it would take the loads, but we did what we could within the budget. And of course, everyone dealt with it differently, the way they used the cluster. This is a guy coming home. You see a slight slope in the floor because elephants can't sleep on flat ground. They have to lie, otherwise they lie on berms naturally, otherwise they can't get up. So there were many interesting aspects of multi-species existence that we learned. You know, this is an interesting image in that these are the poorest people in that society. Even the middle class in Jaipur have to buy tankers of water because there is no water in that city, and there's a great water shortage. Whereas the poorest here have lawns, which is the aspiration of every middle class Indian, you know, of course, a colonial hangover. But, you know, here they have lawns, they grow flowers, they have more water than they need. They, you know, so in a sense, by default, unintentionally, we didn't go out wanting to do this, but in reflection, by valuing the notion of creating an armature for life, you also have an inequity that by default gets corrected. And I think architecture recognizing this can play a big role in making this happen. And life corrodes architecture. As soon as the people moved in there, they made the courtyard the kitchen so they could have an extra room for these many kids. And so, of course, things change and they're malleable. The trees are growing, the goats have arrived, the elephants have a lot of food in their room. Everyone seems to be rather happy. You know, and again, like I said, we haven't painted or plastered because they're going to do that, you know, and now this family of 3 gets on very well together. So they have their chicken, these guys are getting ready for dinner. So, you know, it's different. You see the elephant in the background. This is when it was all beginning to settle as a project. And that's a before and after. You see the transformation just in 5 years. That was an image that was taken about 10 years ago. And the first top image is when we were just starting out there. But you begin to get a transformation. The dish antennas have arrived, which means life is really taking over. And again, by default, because we privileged water so much, the Mahouts later told us that for them that was incredible because their bonding with the elephants has changed. This is in summer when the water is at its lowest. What you see in the background is a 4-room observatory that we've made, which is meant for scholars and others who can observe life here. But this bonding that happens with the elephants and the Mahouts bathing together has completely changed their relationship. Again, through reflection, one understood this and one was happy one privileged water in the way one did. And of course, local species. There were many aspects to the project that I don't want to go into. Just one last example before I close. You know, the Mahouts insisted, and this wasn't part of the brief, they insisted that we create some kind of pavilion where the elephants can hang out together because they're social beings. They can't be isolated so much. So they love hanging out together. So from waste material and pipes, because we had no budget for it, and thatch, we created a series of these pavilions where they could go and hang out for a few hours together. What we didn't realize, again, an unintended consequence, is that the younger generations, those kids who were in the kitchen as they began to become teenagers and social media, they saw this as a business opportunity. So they started a company on the internet called Elephantastic, and you could book a feeding session to go feed the elephants. You could book a bathing session with the elephants, so tourists could come and bathe the elephant for 500 rupees or feed them for 100 rupees. And they turned this into an entrepreneurship. And here you see all the tourists feeding the elephants for 100 rupees as the cost. And the guy's wearing his Elephantastic t-shirt as he squats while he's rolling the money in now. So they were entrepreneur in that they saw this as an opportunity. And this is that little observatory which we built. That portal is built out of slabs of sandstone. It's built out of all the local material organized around a courtyard where, you know, scholars or tourists can go and live in very discreet ways so that the courtyard keeps their happenings very introverted, but they can actually observe what's happening in the village at night and day to study. We thought this would be for people who, you know, have expertise in the area. And so again, those columns are just sort of sandstone columns, one piece of sandstone, because that's the kind of material that's so readily available in the area. This is a mapping of the complexity. I don't want to go into it, but essentially, you know, what you see at the bottom as a band of orange and green and orange is the changing governments and what years they changed. What you see in black are the different government agencies who are our operational clients, from the Public Works Department to the Tourist Department to the Animal Husbandry Department to Forest, etc. It kept changing. The red line indicates our involvement. We were involved consistently, and we became, I realized in reflections, the ones that got them all on the same page, because the mahouts and the elephants didn't have access to the chief minister. We did. The Public Works Department had protocols where they could say some things to the chief minister but couldn't, but we could. So we became the agency that could get them all into the same room to have a meeting to resolve things. And that was a great learning from this project. And, you know, this has letters I wrote and highlighting issues. It's a mapping of just the process of who one was interacting with and what one learned through all those reflections in the course of the project. That's again just a in-progress process where it was abandoned for a while. You see the water body, it was very brown then. Then the trees began to grow, and this was again a 10-year-old image. And you know, then these pavilions have now become the new normal because it works so well. We've got water troughs there. Of course, we're not involved with the project now, but we were for 10 or 12 years because now there's a new government which has again stalled the project, so to speak. So this will go on forever, I guess. And of course, it's signposted now. It's also a project of infrastructure, and of course, finally, the site plan. And our whole ambition was to create, this is a Photoshop rendering, but our ambition was to create a sense of moisture, wetness. The Photoshop rendering here is only the micro dams. The rest is real because, you know, this is what we were trying to sell them to or convince them about to invest more, to create even more wetness for the site. This is an image I got on WhatsApp 2 years ago from one of the Mahout's kids who wrote to me to say the water is full at the end of the monsoon. And you see, the image I showed you was when the water was at its lowest. So it's a transformation. Life corrodes architecture. And this is the kind of project where you've got to let life sort of take over. And it's a humbling experience for architects when you let life take over. And the wettest parts of the site are almost like forests. And so really, just in summary, for me, the nuanced reading of the context is very critical in nourishing how we situate our projects, understand and reflect about them. And I feel from that understanding, I think come the parameters by which one can define quality. It's different for every project and for every situation and for every context, be it geography or otherwise. Now, I just want to, again, literally end with this one, I'm sorry. This is an image from our studio, and you know, the Jain enlightened quester, you know, it really sort of indicates. I'm trying to see how I can. Oh, sorry. Oh, did I stop sharing? No, sorry, I just made a goof up there. Yeah, and you know, here the quester has left the body and just leaving back the profile. And I think images, it's actually an anti-image, but can be compelling because it really is, in a sense, emblematic of the coming together of seemingly contradictory and conflicting systems. And I think the resolution of that finally in the world we inhabit today, in this time of flux, becomes, I think, a very critical parameter for us to weigh, understand, and reflect about quality in architectures. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rahul. I think maybe given the fact that Yasin and I are co-chairing this, it's even more of a privilege to perhaps summarize what I hope to be the view of the majority of the listeners, that you have been able to present a series of intelligent insights in terms of what the contemporary urbanism is, certainly not only in your part of the world, but probably, if we are honest, in wide areas across the world. So this notion of flexibility, the need to think outside the static ideas of what urbanism has been certainly in the North, in this case, Northern Hemisphere, but that you've also been able to convince us with the masterful and beautiful set of projects, and thereby not just merely talk the talk, but present it in a convincing way that thinking and practice and beauty are not hollow phrases, but are actually in unfortunately rare cases, but in your case, fortunately, borne out in reality. So thank you for this very inspiring and infectiously optimistic presentation, despite all the changes and the crises that we are confronting. I think this has been a very, very powerful presentation, and it's only because of this that I've allowed you to go over the 40 minutes.
Thank you.
But anyway, Carlos has a question or a comment, and I give the floor to Carlos and then Elias.
Thank you. Thank you, Wilfred.
Thank you, Rahul, for your exciting presentation. But I do have a question. Don't you think that we are somehow overreacting to the idea of change as a characteristic trait of our times? Because in a way, when you were presenting the first project, I couldn't help but, thinking whether, Roman camps were not exactly the same kind of design problem. So I would like you to comment on that, but before turning to you before your answer, let me comment also on I think that the most interesting thing about your presentation is that you actually present us with a typology of design problems, and the festival city, which I am saying that it is more or less the equivalent of a Roman camp. Okay, then you have the monument, the library, and then you have these in-between projects. So very different design problems, but also design problems that contain in themselves the seeds for their own design solutions. So this relationship between designs and between design problems and design solutions is really, I think, the most provocative, thought of your presentation.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you very much. And, to respond to the Roman camp, which is really your question, the second was a comment. The reason one created that taxonomy that I shared with you within the work on ephemeral urbanism was precisely for this reason, that they are different. We have to see these temporal landscapes in much more nuanced ways. We have to bring temporality into play, into our imagination. For me, I think what I heard from the presentation yesterday, Professor Matsipa, was, how can one make the space for the marginalized, for people who can't participate in the city in the way we imagine city, instrumentalized through architecture and driven by capital or by extraction, and make space. And I think the temporal landscapes offer us some possibility where, so that's why within that taxonomy, if you look at transactions has a temporal scale and a cycle of hours, sometimes a week, sometimes weekends, whereas the cities within that taxonomy of extraction, the landscape of extractions in Chile, those temporary towns last for 50 years because the copper runs out of 50 years in that mine, correct? So each one of them have a completely different temporal cycle. And they also have different aspirational aims, right? So the military camps are about military. What makes that, you can't, I don't think you can compare the Kumbh Mela settlement. It's a good provocation, but you can't compare it to a Roman camp, because the thing about the Kumbh Mela is that it is, well, religious. It has a very single purpose, but a single purpose of faith bringing people together. The Roman camp, which has an invasive single purpose, has a completely different purpose, right? So while they might look the same, and this is my argument that I think images don't often map on intention. And I think that we need to separate if we need to use these more instrumentally to be productive. So I think that really would be my response. I'm happy to engage in the conversation if I have not understood it.
Of course, there are differences, but in a way, in both cases, you have to deal with geometry, materiality, figuration. Yeah. And there are meetings between people in both cases. So
in all those cases,
I know the differences. I'm aware of the difference between the Festival City and the Roman camp. But in terms of design promise, there is a commonality of the problem and of the solution.
Oh, of course. And I think that's why I brought up the question of the kit of parts and how it can be assembled, disassembled. What I didn't have time to go into with the Kumbh Mela, which is actually what inspires me the most in my own work, is the temporal aspect of hierarchy for the governance system. Over a year, it changes completely. And for the period of the festival, it's a completely different governance structure from the time they start instituting the city. And we have a lot to learn from there. So therefore, I think the notion of temporality can go beyond the images it might construct. And I think there are many layers, whether it's organization, whether it's hierarchical, whether there are many other flows and fluxes, that each of these have a lot to teach us, which is what the book has tried to unpack.
Can I just intervene here and say that there are obviously structural similarities, but there are fundamental differences. And if we can leave it here, because of course, I know both of you, Carlos and Rahul, you could go on. We only have a few more minutes for the Q&A. I'd like to make sure that everybody who's raised his hand can ask, please, a short question, and Rahul, please, a short answer. So there are four now, Elias and then João.
Thank you, Professor Mahrota, for this very inspiring lecture. And I would like to make very briefly a quick suggestion and a question. The suggestion would be that this idea of context as generator of practice and the subtitle of architecture in a time of flux might be something we discuss at the end of the conference today as a possible future topic for the third conference in line. I think it is very close to contemporary concerns. I'm thinking of the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman and his idea of liquid modernity. And I think the concept of time in this period would be very interesting to ponder upon. My question is regarding the blurring of boundaries, binary boundaries, and the architectures of transition you talked about. Do you believe it would be helpful to differentiate between spheres of action in our approach? For example, on the one hand, the domestic sphere, and on the other, the public sphere, the public buildings, what Louis Kahn talked about, building of institutions. That's the purpose of architecture. So the domestic and the public. Thank you.
Oh, I mean, the short answer is yes. And, you know, in an expanded version of this, instead of having 2 building examples, I would have done 4 and gone from dwelling, livelihood, you know, down the way, so that one sees these across different typologies, institutions. Of course, that's why the client patron, the nuancing of the client is critical, because that gives you a way that in each of these typologies, the dynamics and therefore the parameters of what we might imagine as achieving quality could be quite different. So absolutely, I'm in agreement. Yeah.
João.
Hi, thank you a lot for your lecture. Raul was just really inspiring. It was amazing, really, thank you. And I have a more technical question. In the last project you showed, though the landscaping project was done by your office, or it was another office that you worked interdisciplinary, like you work in an interdisciplinary way? And also like to know if this project had public audiences. How was the systems that you used for talking with the general population?
Both very good questions. I mentioned the landscape architect. He was someone called Mohan Rao, a practice based in Bangalore. He worked with us on setting up the logic of the landscape, but in the way the architecture also had many compromises, which are many stories. In fact, it's interesting for anyone who might be interested. A few months ago, a group of architects from Jaipur, one of whom teaches at UIC, University of Illinois in Chicago, they've done a book on this, which captures interviews with different people and reflections on the project. It's a book that just came out. It's called Hathi Gaon. So that captures many of these stories. So the landscape was from that, but you know, then of course the forest department took it over and da-da-da. In terms of the public, honestly, there wasn't very much public engagement, because this was very much a government project, and actually dealing with the Mahouts, their families, and then dealing with the different government agencies that came in and out of the project, and then dealing with the different chief ministers that changed every 3 years, sometimes in shorter rhythms, and the number of bureaucrats was public enough. You know, there was no larger public. I mean, people came, there were animal specialists, there were veterinaries, there were doctors, there were other people who were working with elephants who were opposing things that were happening there. So one was negotiating with a lot of constituencies, but not the general public.
Thank you. Kevin, you need to unmute.
Thank you. Thanks, Wilfred. Thank you, Professor Mehrotra, for your lecture. I want to be able to put things in context a bit, because that's how you began. It's within context. And for the last 10 years, I've been teaching studios very, very differently, and case studies very differently. Whereas in the typical condition, we study presidents for their successes. In the work I do in teaching, we study presidents and case studies for their failures. And we don't pick on case studies randomly. We pick the best examples in the world. And it just so happened that the Sept Library and Hathi Gaon were 2 that we did over the last 3 years. And so my questions are 2-pronged. First is a bit more philosophical. There was a very good documentary called Blackfish about how SeaWorld parks are actually worse than prisons. They're almost like torture camps for these amazing orca whales and dolphins that are abused, and there have been many killings because these animals go crazy after a while. Now, with your acknowledgement that the elephants that habitat is not in the north of India, in the hot parts, in the tropics, where do you feel that it's a responsibility of the architect to actually be able to say no to a project, to be able to say, unless we can change the dominant paradigm and not create another viral tourist attraction, that we do not take on the project? So that's the first question. The second one has to do with the...
Can I answer that first?
Sure.
Can I just answer that? Yeah.
Sure.
So no, that's an interesting question. And of course, that is... So the intention of the project it yet continues to harbor elephants that are working. So I actually imagine this as a transitionary. Again, this is what I mean by transitionary thinking, correct? That is, and I know the schemes that were the other competition schemes. The other competition schemes, to speak to your first point, were inspired completely by precedents. And all the other schemes were like the stables that kings had in their palaces for elephants, which had no notion of landscape, hard landscapes where they were dressed up and were actually pretty awful. Those are the dungeons that you can actually, that you're describing. So for us, and this is what I mean by us thinking in transitionary terms, because if one was thinking of an absolute solution, and that was the only way one could go, one would not take on a project like this, right? But one saw the possibility on a site like this to make this transition. The idea was that these elephants finally would be all retired elephants, which has taken longer than it should have, and that it would be a very controlled tourism venue, meaning that people would, in fact, we even designed a museum, we've even designed an observatory station near the parking where they won't even go into the compound. Some of it hasn't been built. So these are contested in those ways, but I think it at least achieves a halfway, that it gives them a much, much, much better existence. And that's why I made the point of the water and all of that. Then they could have imagined either in some of the kinds of solutions that were driven by precedents or in their current state, right? And so there's also been a big lobby, and we've been talking to them about freeing them in the wild. And there are many complications with that, because elephants that have been domesticated, for 60 years of their life can't be freed that easily. So these are all conversations that are occurring. And it's like, why would one design a community toilet in a slum when the slum dweller should be given proper housings? Because I feel if that housing is going to take 10 years, at least for a kid who's 5 years old, they'll have a hygienic toilet to use, right? That's a transitionary solution.
Okay, well, Professor, if that's the case, we all know, or at least it's maybe not common knowledge, that elephants exist within family units. And yet nothing you design there deals with the issue of the family unit. They're all separated from each other. And they are given the little, like an elephant garage. Each elephant is given an elephant garage. And that's not how they live, even in an environment that's not familiar to them.
Right. Now, I mean,
Was
a
that
lot
not
of them,
considered? Yeah.
But the family breakups have happened, before we even came into the projects. The elephants weren't together as families.
Oh, social units too. Social units as well.
That's the reason why. So that's the reason why those pavilions were designed, where they now spend much more of their time. So those were now formalized as part of the project in the second phase, so that they could be in clusters. So you have clusters of 10 houses with mahouts, and then the 10 elephants.
Yeah, but for tourism during the daytime, but the nighttime, the
Kevin,
after hours.
Kevin,
yes.
But
please.
Kevin, I think, Kevin, I'll just say one last thing. What you're asking, it's like you're asking me, why have we gone right-wing in our politics? This is a much bigger structural problem. Within that, if the architect, I say within that, the architect can maneuver within some areas. And that's why I just feel that if we can think transitions, we are better off. Otherwise, it's black and white. I'm not doing the project, let the elephant suffer, or you have a bad design. So
I've got to let Yasna go ahead. Thank you very much.
Kevin, I think that, it's an interesting position that you take, and we can always have ideals that are in some cases absolute, and sometimes some of us have ideals that are relative. And I think that's what the notion of transition is, and whether there is a paradise that we will all reach all together at one stage is another an ideal.
Yeah, but Wilfred, transitions have been used as an excuse for architects in memorial. We use it as a scapegoat, you see, and it's not good enough, is it?
No, but Kevin, I need to make one, that last comment that Kevin made is problematic. The point is that if you have to make transitions you have to take the transitionary solution for appropriate problems. And that's the reason why I showed you two projects in different conditions. You come up with what is close to an absolute solution. So it's this blanket, that's a form of absolutism if you use transitions for everything, or you use absolutism for everything, right? So that's the whole point of the talk, is by understanding that intersection, you try to place yourself appropriately within a temporal scale.
Thank you, Rahul, and thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Elias, and everybody else who's and Carlos for asking questions. We need to take a break now, and given that we've gone over time, the break is only going to be 6 minutes because we're going to stick to our timetable. We'll be back at 40 minutes past the hour. So please take your time to have a coffee or tea and refresh yourself. Thank you, Rahul. Thank you for
Thank you,
fantastic.
Rahul.
No,
Thank you
thanks.
for the fantastic keynote. Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm not sure whether people are ready yet, but I think nevertheless we should try and make a start. I wonder if Eric is there.
Just a second, I'm going to fix my white.
Eric, you are ready, and we're just making sure that people are here. Thank you for being punctual. Jasna, please, your introduction.
So, thank you, Wilfried. I would like to introduce our first panelist, Eric Bellin, who is going to present his paper titled Relationalist Architecture, Detailing Quality Relational Thought Across Scales in Architecture. Eric is assistant professor at Thomas Jefferson University's College of Architecture and the Built Environment in Philadelphia. He holds his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania and MA in architecture from the University of Florida. Before his doctoral studies, he spent time teaching and practicing in Miami. Eric's research is focused on 19th to 21st century histories and theories of building practices at the intersection of design, construction, technology, disciplinarity, and culture. He is the author of a forthcoming book from Bloomsbury Press titled Detailing Worlds, a Conceptual History of Architectural Detail. It tells the story of the emergence of an architectural concept as it evolves in a dialogue with cultural, disciplinary, and technological change. So, Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you all see my screen share?
Yes.
Yes, it works.
Great. Okay, thank you. Hello, and thank you all for coming. In his book, Thinking Architecture, published in 1998, Peter Zumthor suggested that the quality of a building is largely determined by the quality of the joins, the ways in which its parts are put together. And it shouldn't be surprising that the Swiss architect, trained first in the craft of cabinet making, would connect architectural quality to the making of joints. Precision and care in assembling parts has long been a hallmark of quality in Swiss-made things. And as Zumthor invokes joint making, it's difficult not to think of the great Marco Frescari and his well-known claim that any architectural element defined as a detail is always a joint. Frescari posed two ways to understand details as joints. A column capital, he claimed, is a material joint, as the connection between column, shaft, and architrave, while a porch is a formal joint, as the connection between interior and exterior. But the problems that arise in this understanding are immediately apparent when these parts are isolated from their surroundings. They're revealed as simply parts, physical objects or things. They no longer join anything. And in fact, a joint is never constituted in a single thing, but rather in a relationship between things. So here there are literally two joints, the places in which components meet. And this is a subtle but important difference, and one of more than just semantics. And I'll argue that to ever think of a joint, or better yet, to think of a detail as a physical thing is limiting. And today I'll pose a different way to think about detail and practices of building. I'll offer the idea that rather than a thing itself, a detail is more precisely a place where relationships are articulated between things in the world. And those things are the parts, broadly conceived, from which architecture is composed. And while quality of detail in relation to the craft of architecture as a physical object has long been associated with architectural quality more generally, it's my claim that understanding detail as a place rather than thing reveals the central role it plays not only in architecture's execution, but even in the most preliminary stages of architecture's conception. And further, it offers ways of shaping architecture in relation to the social, political, and ethical dimensions of the world around us. So understood in this way, detailing as a practice and the ways of thinking on which it's founded offers one of the most reliable paths to the production of architectures of quality. And I'll frame my argument today in three parts, beginning with a brief conceptual history of detail. So the word detail is ubiquitous in contemporary practice and discourse on building. We use the term constantly in many different ways, and any set of construction documents has pages and pages of details. And yet, before the late 18th century, the word would have meant nothing at all in the practice of an English-speaking architect. Architects like Jones and Wren never drew anything they'd have thought of as a detail, nor did they ever use the term to speak of anything specifically architectural. During their time, the concept was not part of our architectural vocabulary. And I know this because I've searched hundreds of texts in 4 languages, recording instances and tracing the evolution of meanings over time. So the word's etymological origins are in French, stemming from the phrase détailler, meaning to cut something into pieces. And from the 16th century on, this phrase was used in architecture to refer to cut stone and sometimes carved ornament. Through the 17th and into the 18th century, the word détail began to appear in texts on building, but only as a word in general French language, meaning to give a minute or circumstantial account in writing or speech. Though beyond this, the word also found use and new meaning in commerce. Some goods like cloth and meat were said to be sold en détail, meaning when they had to be cut from some larger and integral whole. So this cutting of part from whole is an important dimension of the concept's meaning and one I'll return to. And it was in the mid-18th century that the notion of detail as a noun was first associated with architectural parts, appropriated as an item of disciplinary specific terminology by architects. And the first to do this explicitly was Jacques-François Blondel, the famed French academic. In his writing and teaching, the use of detail was radically expanded. He understood it in various ways as moments within a building's ornamental ensemble. And for him, detail played a central role in everything from architectural character to beauty. And it was in his writing and teaching that detail was first employed as a concept with meaning specific to building practices. And Blondel was the most influential educator of architects in the 18th century, teaching students not only from France, but across Europe. To quote Robin Middleton, his influence was enormous and he dominated the world of architectural theory. And so his students were educated under a paradigm where detail was a concept essential to architecture. And while for Blondel, detail was something ornamental in nature, through 2 of his associates, Pierre Pot and Jean Rondelet, the concept would take a constructive turn. Both Pot and Rondelet taught and published extensively, and again, compared to their contemporaries with radically expansive use of detail. And in fact, it was Pierre Pot who was the very first in a publication on building to use the phrase details of construction. And he did this in his 1769 discussion of new methods of iron reinforced masonry construction. And there are 2 things critical about this term. First is that with the emergence of construction detail as a concept, one finds increased reliance on the section as architects and engineers began probing the matter of construction, formerly the domain of skilled tradespeople, and also binding their work to increasingly nascent bodies of knowledge in structural performance and material science. Second is a focus on the labor and practices of construction, beginning to increasingly visualize processes. So a practice Antoine Bucon has called conception realization. Pot posthumously completed the final 2 volumes of Blondel's course, focused on construction, and in which detail played a central role. The same was true of Rondelet's influential work on the art of building. Here, detail was about technical expertise and processes of execution as a precursor to an aesthetics of building. Over the 19th century, different ways of thinking about detail were cultivated in future architects and engineers at different Parisian schools. At some, aesthetics was foregrounded. Elsewhere, the focus was on economy and execution. And some taught students to think about detail as systematic and a product of new manufacturing processes and technologies. And these ways of thinking were often evident in the careers of their students. And it was another student of Blondel who brought detail to England. William Chambers was the first to write of detail in an English language publication on building. And though the concept's uptake was slow, over the first half of the 19th century, it was appropriated and had become essential to the practice of British engineers and architects alike. In the work of engineers, detail was systematized, serialized, and mass-produced, and the Crystal Palace was the epitome of this approach. Here, nearly the entire structure was composed of just 3 systematized details: at foundation, connection between column and girder, and roof. And these were more than just construction details. Drawing on innovations from the development of railway infrastructure, Each of these details was shaped in relation to a vast network of flows, from manufacture to transport to rapid assembly by unskilled laborers on site to eventual disassembly and reassembly elsewhere. And over the same time period, a very different process was underway in the practice of British architects associated with the arts and crafts. As architects began to develop conventions for the representation of details and their inclusion in increasingly formalized sets of construction documents, they were also inspired by Ruskin and Pugin and their interpretations of the adaptive logics of Gothic work. Arts and crafts architects began to increasingly focus their attention on particular elements: thresholds, fireplaces, inglenooks, built-in furniture, and stairs. And they began in their practice and writing to refer to these larger scale fragments of the work themselves as details. This is similar to Foscari's formal joint, but I'll refer to this larger scale understanding of detail as an elemental detail. Some architects of this time, like Lutyens here in his sketches for Munstead Wood, increasingly began to think through their designs as a series of these elemental details, surrounding the places of things like thresholds, stairs, and fireplaces. And again, they began to explicitly refer to these larger fragments of the work as details within the whole. In fact, in 1892, an outgrowth of the Royal Institute of British Architects published a dictionary of architecture and explicitly defined this larger scale of detail. These larger details, their definition suggested, often have the greatest impact on our experience of architecture, stating that so much is this the case that the spectator regards these larger details more frequently than the general qualities of the work, often found to be so captivated by them as to pronounce on their evidence a decision as to the merits of the design. So by the end of the 19th century, I argue, we have all the basic dimensions of meaning associated with detail in the 20th and 21st centuries, with contemporary understandings shifting and moving fluidly across the lines between. And though in their own time, these things were not necessarily understood as such, I'll venture to show how each as a detail can be understood less as an object or thing, but instead and more productively as a place. In his introduction to a 1952 book on architectural detailing, Richard Neutra drew the distinction between two modes of design thinking, which he called overall thinking and detailed thinking. For Neutra, overall thinking dealt with objects as complete wholes, and more often than not, quote, as abstractions from material processes of production. As opposed to this, Neutra described detailed thinking through, oddly, a series of personal anecdotes about brain surgery, and how at any moment in time, flesh cut and layers peeled back must be understood in relationship to the dynamics of the whole procedure and the life at stake. And about a trip to Sri Lanka, where he watched a Buddhist monk direct the construction of a new temple on site, without drawings, actively choreographing the movements of workers with his words and gestures, from which, quote, details grew in the doing. For Neutra, overall thinking was to frame the object designed as a closed and self-sufficient whole, while detailed thinking was to frame the object designed as open to the world, incomplete and part of something larger, as a place through which over time, materials, labor, and other things flow. Detailed thinking attends to the relationships between these things as much as or more so than the things themselves. And helpful in thinking through this is the concept of correspondence proposed by anthropologist Tim Ingold, who writes on processes of making. Ingold describes making as a correspondence, quote, between maker and material, through which the maker becomes a participant amongst a world of active materials and joins forces with them, bringing them together and splitting them apart, synthesizing and distilling in anticipation of what might emerge, end quote. Through this lens, making is to intervene in worldly processes that are already going on. He gives basket weaving and wheel throwing pottery as examples, ways of making which bring together the motions of the maker with flows of material as they correspond with one another among currents and forces of the environment. The problem for architects, though, is that we design things in advance of their making, and we rarely build them with our own hands. Our act of making is one mediated by representations, as we draw things for others to construct. Though I'll argue through the lens of Neutra and Ingold that detailing is a practice, and detail thinking, on which it's based, when at their best, involve a form of imagined correspondence. So returning now to these prior examples, if you look at a column capital and frame it as a detail, it's likely to ossify in your perception into an object, a form, a lump of inert material to be aestheticized. But if you think of a detail as a place, the place where column meets entablature, the object slightly recedes. And I'd argue that it opens one's perception to the spatiotemporal dimensions of the work, and the visualization of detail as a web of relationships between all things that have and will have flowed through that place over time. So the materials brought from the farm, the labor of those who worked it with hands and tools, the strength of those who hoisted it into place, the weight that compresses and flows through it to the ground, the historical lines of culture of which it's part, and the rain that's shed and marks its surface, and the observer who admires its intricacy from the ground below. And these are all things Blondel wrote of in the 18th century. And at the place of the detail, these things correspond, relationships between them articulated through design. So given more time, I'd offer a reading of each of these things as places in the world through which many things flow and correspond in their making. But for now, I'll simply recall the etymological past of the word, that at its root, detail has always been a perceptual act of cutting some part from an integral whole, if only temporarily in the course of design. It's this relationship of part to whole or place to world that's so important to maintain. Like swaths of cloth, details are places cut from the world's fabric, only to be made anew and stitched back in. And I'll end today by briefly carrying these ideas through two details and projects of quality, and of which I'm quite fond. One is at Conn's Kimball Art Museum, and the other is at Weiss Manfredi's Hunters Point South Waterfront Park in New York. And at the Kimball, I have in mind the place where light enters the interior at the apex of the cycloid vault. For most, it's a familiar detail. Above each gallery, light enters through a gap in the concrete vault, deflected and diffused by an aluminum baffle. And I show these, the construction details for the place in question, to underscore the utter insufficiency of these representations in fully understanding what it is. And even the notes on the drawing acknowledge their insufficiency, exact coordinates of curve available from architect. And indeed, at this place in the world, Kahn had envisioned its possibility and the ways it could bring people and artwork together in light, shaped by architecture. He exhaustively imagined the ways one might mold the other, shaping relationships between surface, light, and space, and how these things could be brought forth by the hands and work of those who would construct it. He thought through the constraints, the processes, and even the bodily motions it would require. A negotiation between people and between matter and energy over time, giving shape to flows of material, labor, light, and more. As a detail, Kahn didn't just approach this moment as the smallest scale of construction, but rather he employed the practice of detailing at this particular place to articulate relationships between things in the world. In the design of this detail at Kimball, he imagined the correspondence between all of these things: materials, labor, spaces inside and out, light, humans, artifacts of culture, and how we dwell in the relationship among these things. And I'll close out with something at a very different scale, an elemental detail at Weiss Manfredi's Hunters Point South Waterfront Park. And the specific place of interest is at a pavilion that mediates between the city, the water's edge, and a ferry stop. And even from the earliest moments of the design, this place was understood by its designers as a node in the world, through which things would flow and be shaped in relationship to one another. The site, which is prone to flooding, was reshaped as a bulwark against rising waters to catch and retain them, but at other times offers a space for play. Its folded roof plane was calibrated in relation to sun and rain, receiving and directing their flows. The form of the building itself is only truly intelligible through this lens. It's been shaped quite explicitly to mediate between all of these things. Through an act of imagined correspondence between the needs of people, the elements of the environment, the materials of the work, its architects sought to collapse distances and bind together strands of the world. This place is a detail, a place where, through design, relationships have been articulated between things in the world. This is a building conceived not as a self-sufficient object, but one that reaches beyond itself, clearly and explicitly as part of some larger social, geographic, and ecological whole. And in conclusion, I've offered the idea that detail should be understood as a place rather than an object or thing, and that detail thinking is a form of relational thought, a mindset focused on framing things designed as parts of larger wholes, and through them, articulating relationships between things in the world. Through the practice of detailing, one can imagine the correspondence between things in the details making and life beyond. And this sort of thinking is essential at the smallest scale of construction, but perhaps even more so at larger scales. I think the most important feature of framing detail as a place rather than a thing is revealed by this notion of the elemental detail and its transcendence of scales. In asking oneself what things one should articulate relationships between in the design of architecture, a world of possibilities opens. And while it by no means rejects aesthetics, it offers a way beyond it and toward the engagement of social practices, culturally specific spatial conditions, and the ethical, political, and ecological dimensions of building. And yes, the refinement of construction details makes for an object of exquisite craft, but it's my claim that embracing an expanded understanding of detail as a place offers a path to many different worlds of architectural quality. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, for this very inspiring and rich presentation. I would like to take the opportunity to perhaps to ask whether, by your opinion, is there any relation between the Nicolas Bourriot and his theory of relational aesthetics, and could it by your means be implied to the interpretation of relational thought of architecture as kind of symptom, and could it be related to our understanding how this kind of thinking improves the quality of place as a articulated space of possible new experiences, by not just in the art museum as aestheticized place, but also in the open place you have shown in your other paradigmatic example of space as a possibility.
Yeah, so I'm not totally, I'm not sure I totally understand the relationship to Palladio's aesthetics, but on the last point you made, you know, a question that I didn't get to ask Rahul that I thought was really beautiful is that he posed this term a few times in his presentation, where he referred to architecture as an armature for life to flourish. And I think that is, you know, paradigmatic of that openness, the idea that the things that we design are essentially complete. And I think what I was trying to get across, particularly in the question of what I'm calling an elemental detail, is the idea that, you know, when you think of detail as a physical object, that we often just correlate it with the materials of the work. And, you know, I think we have the responsibility to think beyond the aesthetics of those material configurations, to think about how the things that we create in the world shape things beyond the work. And that was the essential point of the last portion. And again, I think that was beautifully phrased up by that phrase, an armature for life. It accepts the essential incompleteness of the work of architecture and defers its completion to others.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Shall we proceed with the questions from the audience? Fernando, please.
Thank you. Well, it was certainly a challenge to speak after Rahul Mehrotra's brilliant lecture, but it's incredibly beautiful, your presentation, Eric. Just let me say something about conceptually, your history of detail is very interesting, and but there is something, it remained for me unexplored, perhaps. It is the relation between the moment in which detail is presented as a standard, as a model to be repeated, and the moment in which detail emerges as a way to differentiate the authorship of the project, as a way of difference. Would you have some thinking about this?
Sure. So the summary that I gave is very much a brief summary. I summed up 50 pages of writing in 2 sentences in some cases. So there's a lot more thinking on all those questions. I guess in relation to the first question about I guess standardization, you're referring mainly to what I spoke of when I spoke of the Crystal Palace. Is that the first point?
Yes, the idea that the detail is something to be repeated is a standard. Against the idea that the detail is something that it would be different from building to building.
Sure. So, I think there is no one correct way to approach anything. And what I was trying to, I think, anticipate in that part was the idea that, in the 20th century, we'd be dealing with the prefabrication of many building components, right? And we'd be assembling buildings from prefabricated systems or specific systems. In that case, yeah, sure, things would be repeated for economy. In the case of detail as something personal, these two things, they coexist at any time in the last 150 years. And again, I don't think there's any particular way of approaching detail that should be privileged between them. One thing that your comment makes me think of is that there is this moment in the early 20th century where detail was privileged. This was something explicitly stated by Johnson and Henry Russell Hitchcock when they codified the international style. They posed detail as in opposition to ornament. Historical styles had ornament, modern architecture has detail, and it really was a false opposition. But in that moment, detail was also defined, I think, by them and others like them as a way to give a building a kind of personal signature. Yeah, I'm not too interested in exploring that further. I think where I've really tried to direct my own research is to find the root of detailing as a kind of practice, as a kind of perceptual act of cutting some portion of the work away to be developed and then returned to the world. And for me, the most interesting aspects of that lie in thinking of it at different scales. So that was my focus in this.
Excuse me, we are a little bit out of time, so I would kindly ask you for short questions, if possible. Okay.
It's just like I would just like to make a really short commentary. Actually, praising your lecture. I think the distinction you made in the term of detail, and also not specifically talking about this very complex joints in which we see in extremely high budget buildings across the world, because in the past 10, 20 years, we adopted a culture in which we associate detail with, I don't know, this very complex mullion sections that we see in OMA buildings and this kind of stuff. And I think that it's a very poor, actually, view of what detailing is, because, for instance, this reduces what detail is only to buildings which have an extraordinary budget. Here in Brazil, for instance, I can speak of in the past 2 decades, I don't know, 3 buildings or 4 which had this budget, which are able to do that. But that doesn't mean that the gross of our architecture, which is not inside of the budget, doesn't have detailed thinking, as you said. And I think this categorization that you made is just brilliant, and it broadens a lot how we talk about detail and how we talk about this way of thinking about design and construction. So thank you a lot. This was an amazing presentation. Thanks.
Thank you.
William Curtis, please. Unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
You can.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
Thank you very much for this thoughtful presentation. I wanted to say a bit more about the role of detail in articulating the underlying images and ideas of a project, and in fact the formal structure of, because it seems to me, I happen to be in the car driving over here listening to the Goldberg variations of Bach. You can't move one note. Does that mean there are no details in that music? No, there are details, but they are articulating and sub-articulating themes, separations, spaces, and rhythms. In major works of architecture, those are all things which have perceptual roles concerning also our perception of weight and its opposite, the opposite of weight, which is flotation, which is basic in all architecture at all times, even the most massive. So a joint or a cut or a separation are ways of involving us emotionally in the gestalt of a thing through the material presence and through the sense of interaction of those things. There's an empathetic level to detail. Briefly, 4 weeks ago, at the time of the, I live in France, and I'm living in France. I spent the Journée du Patrimoine in front of the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève for 2 hours, studying through a long lens everything that goes on in the stone of that facade. And of course, it's an absolutely brilliant series of moves and cuts and alliterations and of lettering, which are about the issues I just described, but also about revealing underlying meanings of a work more explicitly or less explicitly, as in a poem. So ornament is not just spelling it out, it's revealing things, it seems to me, in a major work.
Sure. Is there a question in there? Just commentary.
No, not really, no.
Yeah.
That's an
I think one thing that I'll say in relation to that is that those aspects of detail I think have been explored quite a bit in the work of for example, Edward Ford, right? Edward R. Ford,
Yeah.
most are familiar with his books on the details of modern architecture, and also his more recent book, The Architectural Detail. And he talks pretty explicitly about empathy and the animation of architecture and the expression of weight in those things. Also in the work of Harry Mulgrave, who's written extensively on the neurological dimensions of empathy. And for me, in the work of Ed Ford, I always found it a bit unsatisfying. I'm a huge admirer of his work, but in the end, when he defines detailing as a practice, he talks about it as the small scale articulation of construction, essentially. And its expression, its revelation or abstraction of construction. And I always found that dissatisfying because I knew that we use the term more broadly. We use it more flexibly to things that weren't explicitly about the physical body of architecture. And then I guess in my own research, I was sort of hunting for the origins of that and found them in the 19th century. So yeah, I think those are all good comments and totally part of the story, but it's a part of the story that I think others have told well.
Well, briefly, because I enjoyed your description of grammars, which is just what you were doing in a certain sense. But at a certain point, grammars have to be activated into individual statements. And that's when they turn into something else.
Yes.
We need to end here, and we
Yes.
need to thank you, Eric, for a brilliant talk and for a wonderful series of questions. We need to move on. I'm sorry.
Our next step is the second presentation. I would like to introduce now our presenters, Naomi Mehta and Priyanka Salunke, who are going to present a paper on architecture beyond form. They are, I guess, our youngest participants at the conference. They are final year students pursuing their Bachelors of Architecture at Center of Environmental Planning and Technology at Ahmedabad. Naomi is currently engaged in research projects under Dr. Srivansal, studying the impact of urban renewal projects on the networking and diversity in Varanasi. And Priyanka is currently engaged in a research projects under Professor Prachu Shankar, studying the correlation between ideologies and spatial manifestation of modern universities in India. They pursued the method of critical analysis of modern buildings under the guidance of architects, high-end architect Kevin Lowe. As a studio brief at their university. They will be presenting their research for the same today. So Naomi and Priyanka, I would like to invite you to present your paper.
You just share a screen.
Please share your screen with us. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having us here today to be a part of the panel discussion titled From City to Detail. Naomi and I will be presenting our paper, and it's titled Architecture Beyond Form. The argument we are trying to put forth today is that the quality of an architectural intervention is assessed primarily through its established narratives of success. Architectural imagery generated through form and aesthetics is mistaken as a representation of its architectural quality. But what's amiss in this perception is the idea of it being inhabited with respect to its social, economical, and cultural context. To evaluate the same, the selected projects are both modern buildings with lauded forms that introduce their context to iconoclastic ideas of living. While Golconda promotes the aesthetic lifestyle of its users in the presence of lush green gardens, Kanchenjunga promises a luxury of views and voluminous spaces. But how can these projects, picturesque photographs, and evocative sections be the sole determinants of their quality? A holistic perception can be derived and analyzed objectively by employing a methodical critical analysis from its intent to its articulation across different scales of design. First, we are trying to understand the building as a part of the city. A building is a part of a larger social, cultural, economical, and political fabric and not simply an object. Reinterpreting the brief and bringing and being truly responsible for what we make is extremely crucial in today's time. Second, we will be looking at the organizational strategies and planning. The plan and sectional organization of a building, when understood in cohesion, establish true relationships between different functions and realms of the inside and the outside. And third, we will be looking at materiality and design detailing. It becomes imperative to evaluate the consistency of the project across scales in manifesting its concept. The experience of an architectural detail should be a combination of its aesthetic appeal and delightful engagement. These parameters must then be analyzed in conjunction with one another because they are interdependent. The first project where this framework of what we think defines architectural quality is tested in the case of Golconda. Golconda is situated in the planned grid French settlement of Pondicherry. Zooming in further, one can see how the building is oriented diagonally to use maximum length, giving itself the advantage of being perpendicular to the north-south axis, maximizing ventilation. The hot and humid climate type of Pondicherry also asks for protection from the hot summers, and hence the north corridor in the Golconda provides a necessary buffer for the same. The principal design essentially is the presence of two wings, which house the room for retreat for the disciples of Sri Aurobindo, and are hinged with a stairwell as well as toilet facilities. The presence of louvers on either sides of the wings allows ample ventilation. In section, as you can see, the top floors are meant for retreat for the individuals, with the first two floors being bedrooms and the last floor housing the studio for the artists. The ground floor, it houses the space for the community to come together and perform activities together, such as cooking, the daily laundry, and also houses various rooms for storage. The dense vegetation in the south and the sparse vegetation in the north also further induces ventilation. This idea of having hundreds of louvers as the skin of the building that when open makes you feel like there is no building at all. These pictures of the frugality of the spaces and details and the lush green gardens makes one believe that this building is nothing short of perfect. But are these pictures and established narratives enough for us to judge its architectural quality? More readings about the building exposed us to this statement made by the architect. He writes, the purpose of the dormitory was not primarily the housing of the disciples. It was the creating of an activity, the materialization of an idea by which the disciples might learn, might experience, might develop through contact with the erection of a fine building. So this idea is something I thought I must investigate to understand what the building should truly mean to those who are inhabiting this material manifestation of Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo's philosophy consisted of two large ideas. One was achieving divine consciousness and the other was human unity. While the seeking of the greater consciousness is for the individual that one can achieve through the retreat in this building, the ideas of human unity come about when these individuals interact with each other. In fact, according to Sri Aurobindo, the communal activities are in fact the deepest spiritual need of the individual, and also engaging with the rest of the world for overall upliftment, so everyone reaches this level of greater consciousness. So the critique that was taken forward unfolds itself in the order of the following parameters. We start with understanding how the building caters to the individual, then a society of individuals, then we move to the ground floor, which hosts the communal space. And all of these are being invested primarily through the lens of organizational strategies and planning, and also materiality and design detailing. And then eventually we'll see how Golconda interacts with the city. Starting with the catering to an individual, one sees the design rooms are rather very spacious, so as to make the disciple aware of every movement in the space to complement his or her experience during their retreat. The furniture as well is finely crafted along with the asbestos louvers. The rooms are also quite voluminous and the louvers on either side of the room allow for ample amount of ventilation. Examining the organization and planning of the entire floor, it consists of rooms for the individuals, an admin office, common toilets, and a main and a service staircase. Congestion of movement is recognized due to the inefficient separation of private, semi-private, and semi-public realms. Not only is the placement of toilets problematic due to its placement very close to the semi-public realm of the staircase, the separation of the bath and the toilet seats on two split levels fails to address the ritual of cleansing in the morning, making the experience extremely inconvenient. The placement of the toilets further faces the street, reducing the privacy of the space. Shouldn't architectural quality be recognized as the finer nuances that the building must address? Isn't it important in a program such as that of Golconda to understand the act of cleansing as a daily ritual furthering the experience of one's retreat? A possible organization strategy could have been the grouping of private and semi-private realms together and bringing both the bath, toilet seats, and wash to the same level. The close placement of the bath to the trees furthers the experience of the daily ritual of bathing, providing the users with a refreshing start to the day, thus adding a meaningful quality to the architectural experience. We now move to analyze the communal realm of the building. The ground floor hosts various functions that trigger the communal interaction of the users and complement the solidarity of the retreat that takes place on the top floors. It consists of a main passageway on the north side with rooms lined up to carry activities such as cooking, laundry, and it also consists of storage spaces. The conclusion was that the ground floor essentially serves two kinds of functions. One is the communal activities and the other is the storage that supports these communal activities as well as the overall functioning of the building. The rooms in the basement are rather dark and dingy, and these spaces don't support the communal activities such as cooking and laundry that take place. Similarly, The storage areas, the second type of function recognized, as well become dark holes, and some functions like the garden store, which serves the entire expanse of the site, is not appropriately placed. As one can see from these pictures, the user's hands spill out to the gardens, seeking light. This happens because the activities of the basement are subjected to the structure appropriated for the retreat alone and not for the communal activities that are to take place in the ground floor. This problem of the dark and dingy spaces also arises because of the relationship the ground has with the gardens, which is rather harsh, with few to no activities spreading towards it. Here one realizes how hence the gardens are looked at as pristine entities that cannot be touched. Shouldn't a building striving for architectural quality attend to communal activities with utmost care and foster the communal relationships that the users of the space wish to receive when they are in their abode, when they are in the abode of their philosopher's material manifestation? A possible solution to the same is derived by establishing a better relationship with the garden by making it accessible and hence increasing the light intake in the ground floor. Planning and organization of the ground floor is revised by separating the realms of the activities such as cooking, communal dining, and washing of vessels that are grouped to the left wing, and storage is grouped to the right wing. Reinterpreting the whole ground floor as a veranda where one activity can flow into the other, fostering the communal needs, enhancing its architectural quality. Architectural quality, reinterpreted in these terms of fostering relationships, allows activities to spill out to the ground, and materiality and design detailing is revised to further the experience of the commune. Storage of the ground floor can be dealt with while still addressing the spirit of the veranda by pushing one's creativity in the materiality and design detailing of the storage. The modules, when repeated across the longitudinal axis of the build, serve different functions while still establishing a language serving both the activities that take place on the left side as well as serving the immediate function of the storage itself. The next level of analysis was vis-a-vis the context, and one sees how the building entirely isolates itself from the city. There are two entry points, both only serving the building, one being the main entrance and the other being the service entry at the back. If Sri Aurobindo defines transcendence to be not an act of isolating yourself, but also the act of engaging with the rest of the community and the mediocrity, so everyone can reach a higher level of consciousness, why does Golconda then raise a 3.3 meter high boundary wall wanting nothing to do with its immediate community, the residents of Pondicherry, the marginalized? In translating a philosophy into a program, a crucial aspect of the philosophy itself is lost. A proposal to deal with this missed opportunity hence includes the thickening of the boundary wall. Golconda hence opens up as portals to serve the marginalized community of Pondicherry, providing one with meals once a day and extending services of laundry as well. Materiality and design detailing is dealt with such that the walls open once or twice a day to serve the extended community. The building could possibly activate the street life of the city as well, and hence enhance the architectural quality of the street too. To conclude, we would like to say that we've tried to do in all of the proposals, all that we've tried to do is understand relationships, as we believe when they are addressed rightly, the architectural quality of a space is addressed. Be it the relationship of the communal spaces with the gardens or the relationship of Golconda itself with the city. Emphasis has been laid on reinterpreting the brief after truly understanding the intent and then serving both direct and indirect users. How wonderful is it if our architecture can affect the lives of people it wasn't directly meant for? Isn't that how architecture can truly move people? I would now like to hand over the presentation to Naomi, who will be discussing our second case of the iconic Kanchenjunga apartments.
Like Golconda, the Kanchenjunga Apartments by Charles Correa has always been perceived through its established narrative of success and the imagery which makes it iconic. The Kanchenjunga Apartments is a multi-story luxury condominium designed by Charles Correa. It is located in the dense Upper Echelon neighborhood of South Bombay in close proximity to the Arabian Sea. The project redefined what vertical luxury living could be in a city so densely packed. It challenged the matchbox living with its double-volume cantilevered terraces, majestic views of the sea, and its stunning elevation. The iconic split-level section with terrace gardens was designed to maximize cross-ventilation. This novel concept promised to deliver the experience of a bungalow in the air. To facilitate these large cantilevered balconies, a structural system with a central service core and shear walls was adopted, generating 2 symmetrically mirrored apartments on each floor. The central arrival foyer is a dark and dingy space lacking access to light or ventilation. The entrances to adjacent apartments face one another, lacking exclusivity and privacy. Every floor plan is designed with centrally placed living spaces enclosed by a buffer of verandas and bathrooms. Unlike other bedrooms of the house, the servant quarters are placed in the buffer zone, having inadequate access to light and ventilation. This disregard for human comfort continues across the design of the kitchen and the bedroom. Across all unit types, the split-level section with intermediate levels creates discontinuity across the unit, disabling flexibility of space. This sense of discontinuity prevails in the design of fixed glass windows all across the house that prevent the iconic cross-ventilated section from manifesting itself in the actual apartment. In this detail, there is consideration only for the passage of light, but not air. The Kanchenjunga derives its form from the sections of the Unite, the Indian bungalow, and the modernist facade. The symmetrical elevations and uniformly placed terraces on all corners of the Kanchenjunga, when examined in plan, reveal the constant exposure to harsh heat and rain one group of apartments face throughout the year. To avoid a compromise on the formal expression, the unit does not design itself to appropriate itself to the hot and humid climate of Bombay. Is vertical luxury living at Kanchenjunga only about size, form, and views? Can this be the basis of architectural quality? In response to these findings, one can envision alternate possibilities across the unit level, working towards manifesting the cross-ventilated section by redefining the different thresholds of arrival and separation with considerations for air, light, and privacy. A continuity could be established between the living, dining, kitchen, and terrace areas to allow each to expand into the other. The servant quarters could be designed to become dignified spaces of rest with access to light and ventilation. The large terrace and the veranda regions could have been designed with 2 layers of collapsible openings for the living room and the bedrooms to protect them from heat and rain when required. Responses to climate can be designed in a way that they allow spaces to transform their character when needed. The engagement with plan, section, and detail of the units holistically can bring the intent of the cross-ventilated section to translation, while allowing the users to customize spaces as per their thermal and personal needs. The Kanchenjunga has always been experienced from a distance, standing out in its context. These are the iconic pictures we all have seen. Hence, one always discusses its relationship with the sky and the city at that scale, like an object on a platform. But how does this building actually meet the ground? The Kanchenjunga is raised on a podium. The urban edge of the building with 2 entrances along the main road is unarticulated. It is encroached upon by vehicles, bus stops, litter, and blank facades of shops that cannot be directly accessed. There is a lack of an appropriate threshold between the realm of the street and the realm of the building. The building houses multiple shops within its complex. The initial floors of the building are occupied by the consulate, followed by residential apartments. Thus, the building caters to multiple programs and multiple user groups using a single arrival court. There is a lack in articulation of thresholds at ground level between private and public realms. The unarticulated ground floor does not recognize the requirements of multiple users and programs, creating an overlap in vehicular and pedestrian movements. All the parking spaces at basement level and entrance lobbies are dark and dingy. No spaces of rest are identified for the staff at ground level who have to inhabit such spaces during the day. The circulation patterns of various users reveal the intense overlap in their zones of arrival and transition, overcrowded, lacking a sense of arrival. The essence of the cross-ventilated section is not carried through to the ground floor. The building does not establish any relationship with its ground through organizational or detailed strategies. How do we then determine the architectural quality of buildings that fail to appropriately respond to the city in their immediate context? Amidst the dense fabric of Bombay, could sunken courtyards be used as tools to create interfaces between private and public realms? They could become anchors for designing circulation, arrival zones, and programmatic relationships that respond to all users and users at ground. The Kanchenjunga can be reimagined to lie nestled between two courts opposed to the raised podium it stands on. The design sensibilities could extend to all places on the ground as well as the basement levels, where the courtyards could be like light wells ventilating the parking levels of the building. The focus on creating quality spaces should not differentiate between service and served spaces. The urban edge could be an interface between the street and the building, participating in the public life of the street. The building, which had a front and back before, through the ground floor reorganization, could have different faces of the building becoming arrival fronts. The intent of the iconic section stretching facade to facade to facilitate cross-ventilation could be carried through to the ground floor design, creating spaces that breathe. The section could holistically create a sense of luxury and manifest its intent from the ground to the sky. The method of critical analysis at every scale of design, in these cases discussed, has revealed some parameters for assessing architectural quality. Architectural quality should be defined by well-lit and ventilated spaces, which provide for all user groups. It should be about spaces that allow transformation and adapt to the climatic and user requirements from time to time. It should be achieved by employing creative solutions in reimagining utilitarian templates. A project should not compromise on serving the essential needs of each user and use, while negotiating with issues of security, privacy, bylaws, and other such contingencies. As discussed in the cases of Golconda and Kanchenjunga, many design sensibilities that were prominent at, say, the organizational scale of a module did not extend to the larger organization within the city. Architectural quality can be holistically determined only when a project has created appropriate relationships at every scale of design and detail, from the city to even a bathroom drain design. In doing so, architectural quality can propagate the conception of form and content in unison. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. Now we have some time left for questions. Do we have any questions? Then I would like to. Okay, I can wait. So Carlos, please.
Yes, this is the second time in the conference that we have after Vishnu and Hamzika that we have architectural criticism presented as redesign. And I'm curious to know whether these idea of redesigning is a common studio problem in architectural schools in India.
Priyanka.
You have to unmute.
Me.
Yes, actually, Vishnu, Hamsika, Naomi, and I have we have like taken up this. We had taken up the same studio along with architect Kevin Lowe and architect Shubhra Raje, and we so it's one studio that we all have done, and hence we had given our proposal to present in this conference. So I don't think it's a trend, but we're from the same studio, so that's why probably you see the similarity.
Yeah,
In,
it was a good presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was just curious if there is, okay, Luis, please unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. I just wondered because it came about in my mind, is all that commercial space around the apartment building planned from the beginning as part of it, or it's something that happened afterwards? Because I happen to be fortunate to have been in Mumbai, and I know that things start adding afterwards. So I would like to know if it was the architect, and we know who he is, planned also the commercial space or at the same time of the building, or it's something that happened afterwards.
So there were shops designed at the ground level of the building from the initial design itself.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask you, could you explain in more detail what you meant about this neighborhood public spaces when you mentioned that it is like a building on the platform, like the iconic sign in the urban fabric? But if I understood properly, without any relations to this public space in both cases, or?
So in Kanchenjunga, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. So in Kanchenjunga, the building has a base level podium within which it has designed certain shops, and the residential entry point happens to be in the same space. So there is an overlap between a private and a public realm over there. And the entrance is from the main street, the main Pedder Road. And everybody, all vehicles and pedestrians enter from the same region. So in that sense, whenever we've discussed Kanchenjunga, it has always been while looking at the facade. And one never really realizes how this building is interacting at the ground level. And so the idea of it being detached, literally and even in that sense from its ground, as it does not establish any threshold or articulate any relationship for the different programs that it houses within its complex.
Is there any hope, so to say, to how could this situation, inappropriate situation, be perhaps transformed in a way that it makes some community space, or the space that could allow social interactions?
So in the proposal, can I share my screen? Just for a minute, maybe. So in the proposal, the building has been reimagined to not have the podium. And in order to define thresholds, one could maybe use sunken courtyards. And in this way, the building has different arrival fronts for the different programs that it houses. And the shops have been pushed to the periphery to become the threshold between the street and the building.
Thank you. We have several questions. Fernando is the first in the line, then Raul.
Thank
Fernando.
you. Thank you. Congratulations, Priya, Naomi, for a very good presentation and very disciplined, interesting analysis and proposals. Following this idea of redesign of criticism, I would like to remind that I was in a jury this year here in Buenos Aires in University, Ditela University, where some of the very classical jewels of modern architecture are being proposed as to be intervened and redesigned for to adapt them to current conditions. And I think this is a very critical issue for us to deal with this legacy of modern architecture. Because of sustainability, we must now work with reuse rather than rebuilding. So this is a very critical issue, I think, in terms of sustainability and in terms of our point of view, how to deal with pieces of architecture that are considered in many cases masterpieces, but at the same time need to be addressed with respect, but with intelligence and how to say, microsurgery to adapt it to current times. So it looks like a very interesting field of for the future.
Thank you.
Would you like to comment on this, Priyanka and Naomi?
Yeah, I mean, you were extremely, I think another thing that our generation also needs to deal with is also the overproduction of buildings that has happened. And like you rightly said, it is time to reuse and not rebuild. So that was also something that we were keeping in mind. And while taking up this research forward in the last semester, these were issues that we were also actively discussing, and I'm really glad you could identify that, even though we didn't like explicitly say it. So yeah, thank you.
Our next question comes from Professor Raul Malhotra.
No, thank you very much. No, thanks, Priyanka and Naomi, seeing this, and it's evolved since we last talked. So no, I actually, Fernando already began to set up what I was going to say, and I might be repeating myself, but I'd frame it differently. In fact, for me, I think from a pedagogical perspective, I don't think you can frame this as criticism. It's an adaptive reuse project that you've done in both cases. Because if it was a rigorous criticism pedagogical framework, you would have bought in, I think, what I touched upon my earlier talk, which is the temporal quality of how quality also changes and has a temporal dimension, right? So I think to Luis's point and to point about Golkund, if you look at archival images of Golkund and you go back to that, which are in all the books that are on Golkund, you see how Golkund is set in a neighborhood of domestic singular family houses. And so therefore the intent was to create, to cut it off, to not compromise the privacy of what was adjacent to it, right? And so that was the intent. So to situate it as criticism only in the contemporary without the context in which it was made, it doesn't make it criticism because it hasn't looked at it through that temporal scale. So therefore, I think as an adaptive reuse project, it's brilliant. And I think the analysis that you've done to situate the reuse is also really very well articulated. And I'd say the same thing for Kanchenjunga, where even the criticism of the staff toilets being, I mean, the staff quarters being put on the edge for the time, now this is over 55 years old, 60 years old in its conception. The fact that the staff even got ventilation and he managed to flip it by giving the entrance no ventilation, but giving the staff ventilation was, I mean, a big breakthrough for that time. The shops on the ground floor, I mean, the truth is, and I know this from the inside, he wasn't part of the project at the end. There was only one shop in the front and the rest was just an open structure that was left. So it wasn't retrofitted in the way it is, but it's problematic even though. And therefore, when I look at that also as a reuse by you carving out the courtyards and things is brilliant. But I think as a pedagogical frame, it's analysis that has led you to a very robust reuse and adaptive reuse of those buildings, keeping their integrity intact. So it's a fabulous critical conservation project, and framed as such, it means completely different things to me. I think to treat them within the rubric of criticism is maybe an overstatement, just for you to think about as you go forward, because it might limit the way you would imagine adaptive reuse. So that's really a pedagogical kind of input.
Would you like to answer?
I mean, the philosophy of Sri Aurobindo itself, even 50, 60 years back, when this project was conceived, was still to help out the marginalized, to help them come up. And I think that way the word criticism is still, I mean, I can still use it even back, even keeping, of course, it is, of course, an adaptive reuse as well. And we are like, the way it is addressed right now, we are keeping the current dynamics of the society also in mind. But even like back then, this is something he preached to, you know, help out the marginalized to, so that they could also reach this higher level of consciousness. So I think even back then, to do something like this wouldn't have been something that was probably out of context, because it was something that he preached even back then.
But the pressures were different, that's all, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. We have two more questions. So, but excuse me, if you would like to add something, Professor.
Can we make these next questions brief, or comments brief, please, because we need to move into the round table.
Joao?
Just a very punctual question. Your reuse proposal, we talk about problems, for instance, how the building fits into the site, questions of comfort and so on, which all deal with the functional aspect of the building. And in these terms, you were brilliant, in my opinion. But I'd like to ask if I know that Charles Correa's building, it's very iconic and has a very strong heritage role in Indian society and so on. I don't know what is the status of the first building in this regard, but I'd like to know if you didn't have interest also in make like minor aesthetic changes in the building, if there was something that your sensibility when you looked at it and you said, oh, you know, that there's something here, I think it could be aesthetically enhanced somehow or something like that.
Would you like to answer? It seems we've lost.
The idea was to look at what has guided the aesthetic of the building. And when you look back at how the decisions of aesthetic have really worked out on the inside, and how are they forming different relationships or informing the critical content within the building, they didn't seem to be in tandem. So, for example, the large terraces, which are extremely luxurious for a climate like Bombay, also worked only on one corner. And for the other apartments, when it used to heavily rain, that is a 6 meter by 6 meter space, which is overly exposed. So in terms of achieving a certain aesthetic relationship, I feel like that was the relationship being compromised. And thus, one of the proposals was to introduce a collapsible screen, which would still allow the terrace to exist and give the user the choice to close it up when it was too hot. And it would also become like an outdoor room for them in those scenarios. So that was how we approached the analysis.
Thank you very much. We have, William, do we have time for more questions?
Yes.
Wilfried.
Briefly, please.
Okay.
Very
William,
brief.
please.
Yeah, I wanted to actually say something about situating both of these buildings historically, because they are themselves critiques of earlier things within the type. Golconda is a brilliant building, but it's also taking on board the basic idea of a student residence as a raised slab, which comes from the Pavillon Suisse of Corbusier, and doing what he failed to do, which is deal with the environment. And it's also taking forward the research into the Brise Soleil in a more or less tropical condition, which was also being worked out in Brazil in the Ministry of Education. So the issue of movability, vertical slats, horizontal slats, is part of a continuing research within the modern movement as it goes and meets different climates. In a somewhat similar but different way, Charles Correa's building is a kind of child of the unité d'habitation in the section and in blending the section with the, his reading of the Indian village and putting the two types together with some limited success in terms of climate, as you pointed out, and even socially. But I do think that all buildings have antecedents, and part of our understanding of them, I think, requires one to see that they're not just unique statements, they're part of a string of solutions.
Thank you, William, for this comment. I guess this will be of our final question in this session. So would you pass it on?
Yes, I'll be as brief. I think it was a wonderful presentation by Rahul. I'll take from there and what William said as well. And on the face of it, and I couldn't, actually, I was not to speak. I was provoked by the three Indian presentations, and I think Curtis will know why I got provoked. I live next to the Golconda home for the last 40 years. And I take the opportunity of living in that space and coming out. I would say that, as Rahul pointed out, and this happened in the Gandhi Ashram one, and I wanted to, I think I emailed Trenton on that and just left it. It happened in the Gandhi Ashram one, and Rahul stated it, but didn't kind of clarify it, that if we are taking buildings of early modernism, or if we're taking, or any heritage critique that we want to do, first, I would agree this is more adaptive reuse than critique. I would be with Rahul on that. But if we were doing a critique, I have seen Golconda change from 1984 till today. I've seen the context changed. I've seen the gentrification of that landscape. I've seen a change in relationship between people in the social context. I've seen the monastic feel vanish at times. So there are all kinds of other layers that happen when someone comes to these contexts now. So I think if the project can really open up, it's a valid critique if it is a critique of now, today and now. But I don't see it as a valid critique until we have taken sections across time. That doesn't mean they don't have any infallibility. Of course, they have a lot of problems. But Golconda, I have done now 4 buildings inspired by Golconda. Golconda has no fan, no air conditioning. And in this part of Tamil Nadu, you cannot live with a fan or air conditioning. So it has, at one level, served the purpose that without fan, without an air conditioning, it manages to remain cool. I agree a debate can open up on what we mean by comfort, human comfort. If I'm used to an air conditioner and they come into my building, they would curse me. They would curse me. But for Rahul's majority who doesn't live with the air conditioning, these are the most resilient, sustainable buildings. So it's an issue of how do we look at sustainability? How do we look at these layers? How do we look at relationships between the residents in that place, and how did these relationships change? I felt the same about Gandhi Ashram because, and I think Wilfred kind of brought it up, that there's a gentrification that happens to an ashram or a home when it becomes a public monument. So I think the critiques, if they can absorb that, we will have a more broader critique. But I think what this has opened up is a completely new way of re-engaging with these modernistic relics. I'm not a protagonist for the modernist, but I would say that it needs to be opened up because that spirit of free nation, I'm still a protagonist for, what they were carrying, what they were, that energy, I'm still for it. So I would just open it up on that. I was not to speak. Thank you for giving me the time, but it was too close because Golconda is just on the next street where I stay. So I thought for the sake of international misconception, maybe I come in at this point. Thank you very much. Sorry for the time.
Thank you very much for this additional, very important dimension for widening our lens. So I would like now, if you agree, to invite Wilfried to brings us an overview of this session and leading
Yes,
us to the concluding synthesis remarks for, and at the same time, introduction to our roundtable discussion, Wilfried.
Thank you, Jasna. Thank you for co-chairing this and moderating the questions. Thank you for the various questions and comments. We are coming to the closing part of the final session, and what I found very satisfactory or satisfying was the way that these three presentations were in a way complementary, that we had a practitioner and a theoretician and an advocacy agent bringing things together, and Rahul, with Eric's presentation, the focus was on the detail. However, the focus was also expanded, didn't just cover the notion of the detail as we are accustomed to consider the detail as a small element in the whole. And I think what seemed to me the most important insight was that the detail is a place to the world. I think that's what Eric was saying at one stage. And if that is the case, then it is so much more than just simply a construction element or something of a joint. That was made very clear in Eric's presentation. I think that the same applies to the Priyanka's and Naomi's presentation, that they were able to refocus from that small, apparently small scale back to the city and to take the whole into consideration. So situating a building in the larger context, or situating a detail in the larger context, I think is the key issue that I think we can take away from this particular session. Now, allow me to attempt to put things together at the end of this, and I will propose a series of thoughts that we might wish to discuss. First of all, the notion of quality refers to, I would say, in a set of inherent properties that built phenomenon possesses. And of course, we've talked a lot about the relationships that such a built phenomenon. I use the word built phenomenon, or the phrase built phenomenon, because it also includes landscapes, urban designs, and even small elements. So we've got both the internal logic, and we have the relationship to a larger built world, or the immaterial context, as Rahul mentioned. So these are two sides of one coin, if you like. But in order to be able to speak about this, and this was in a way more topic of the first conference when we talked about architectural criticism, we need a descriptive method that allows us to identify individual components of these inherent properties, or the individual relationships that we've talked about. So, but if we put these things together, and I would submit to you that beginning with Silvia Arango's presentation, which was a review of the Vitruvian triad and went beyond it, I was provoked to think that there are these base properties that buildings should possess anyway, that they should obviously satisfy the purpose for which they were built, that they should stand up and not collapse, and that they should provide a sense of delight and be aesthetically pleasing. Now, not many buildings do that, but most buildings satisfy to some extent the purpose, and they certainly stand up, otherwise they wouldn't be in existence. So that's base properties. And then there is a set of core properties. And these core properties, I would suggest, are another level which not every building achieves. And it's a level that is to do with the degree of integrity. And integrity in terms of the compositional integrity. So parts to whole. And Eric's presentation, in a way, was a clarification of this particular topic. So there's a logic behind the way that things are being assembled, and it's beyond logic. That also the way that a brick is in a wall, the way the wall is part of a room, the way the room is part of a set of spaces, the way that the set of spaces is part of the overall building, and the way that the building relates to the site. These are all compositional relations of parts to whole. The next thing is that there should be an integrity between the intentions behind a building and its realization. So if architects or clients talk about things which don't actually materialize in the final building, it lacks conceptual integrity. And we find that quite often in architecture. Thirdly, there should be a relationship between the building, the phenomenon, becoming part of a community. And fourthly, it makes a contribution to society in ethical terms. So there's an ethical integrity. Its embodied ethos, its political attitude makes an appropriate and constructive contribution to society. So those are the core issues which we've talked about in different presentations. We identified the lack in certain instances and the strength in others. And then the topic that William was talking about, and we discussed after his presentation, that there are things such as aspirational properties that go beyond the compositional and the physical, that are that identify a building finally as an architectural masterpiece. The way that the built phenomenon is both a unique condensation of many historical roots while also serving as a universal model. And that at best, built phenomenon becomes a cultural symbol of a community. It is part of its heritage. You can't say that of many buildings. And finally, that built phenomenon is a touchstone of civilization. That is, the built phenomenon has the capacity of opening and transforming the minds of its users. It's part of a consciousness forming phenomenon. It is able to get us to reflect on our own existences, and it makes us into better beings. That, I think, is one of the most difficult things to achieve. But I think that I'll give you one example of this, or two examples. One is Louis Kahn's Salk Institute. When you enter that central space, I think you understand that you are only a small element in the vast universe when you confront the Pacific Ocean being connected to the Pacific Ocean by this small stream emerging from the floor of the courtyard. Or another case in point is Hans Scharoun's Philharmonic Concert Hall, which, if anybody has been in it, is one of the most amazing experiences. You understand that, yes, it is possible to have another kind of relationship amongst audience members, as well as to the music, as well as to the orchestra. And I think it makes people realize that other things are possible. So, to me, I take away from this conference these ways of thinking about quality, and I think that I find that if we try to order them into these different layers, these three layers, it is a way of structuring our thoughts and ultimately back to a way of analyzing, evaluating, and criticizing, and finally assessing the quality of a built phenomenon. So I leave you with that for the moment, and we can discuss. I would like to discuss right at the end the potential topics of future conferences. So thank you for your attention so far. Are there any comments or reflections? João?
Eric is actually ahead of me. You raised your hand first.
Sure. I'll just add one thing. I think it's an important point that Rahul made is the connection between quality and values. And I think that that's something that needs to somehow work its way into that series of tiers. Because even if you think of the base properties in terms of utility and beauty, beauty it's subject to cultural values and to personal tastes and all sorts of different criteria for evaluation. So I think that somehow that needs to be built into that system of evaluation. And also we know uses change over time. I think that's something that Matsipa talked about yesterday in relation to one of the buildings, an urban building that's uses had changed. And I think that, again, the capacity not necessarily to serve one use, but to serve many and to transform over time should be part of that evaluation.
Yeah, Eric, just a quick answer. I think that the issues of values certainly are core properties in terms of cultural integrity and ethical integrity. That's where I would see that particular aspect. João.
I think it's also interesting, Wilfred, how you position these three conceptions as three levels, almost if it was hierarchical. So you have aspirational properties on the top and so on. And when you were talking, I remember a book I have read recently from Axel Honneth. It's called Struggle for Recognition. It's pretty interesting. He has this idea, which he basically took from a book from Hegel, in which the development of a subject in modern society is the one which it is three steps. The first one, he says it's about the subject being able to feel love for other people. So he is able to construct healthy and respectful relationship with other people and so on. And he makes this loving relationships. And the second one then is when he starts to mature and grows a professional dimension of his life. So he's not only able to love others and being respectful, but then he's able to be a good professional and deliver works with high standards and so on. And then he says there's a third level, which for Hegel is like the sublimation of the subject, which is the ethical sense. So he not only is loving and respectful, he is a good professional, but then he, on the top, is able to make some insightful contributions to society and to give something back. And I think what he says about this whole structure is that everything is built on recognition. And I think it's something that I can clearly see also in the way you put those values, that it's the top of it. It's basically social recognition, and it's something that, for instance, I can talk about many works here, but taking one that presented today from Professor Raul, you can see that it deals with this idea of something that is inserted into cultural context and is socially recognized, and then emerges the notion of quality.
Thank you, Jean. Louise.
Thank you for your small summary and presentation, Wilfred. I think it was quite enlightening. I have a very, very small comment on that. The patio of the Salk Institute and the water are by Luis Barragan.
Okay.
Then I have a more general assessment or comment on the whole 4 days that we had. And I have to commend you and also commend the rest of the colleagues that have worked in it, because I think we had a very open view of what's going on around the world. We had India, we had Brazil, we had Africa, and of course we have other countries that we're probably much more familiar with. So I really commend you all, because it has been enlightening to be here, to learn, to see, to try to see through the eyes of other regions, other ways of feeling, other ways of taking into account the different levels of quality, and congratulations to all.
Thank you, Louise. Much appreciated. And thank you, everybody who participated. William.
Yes, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes. Go ahead. Oh no, no, William, you've just switched off. Yeah, now you're on.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd like to second that and to say thank you very much to both Wilfred and Jose Manuel for having put this together. And indeed, it does offer a kind of lateral series of thoughts on the state of architecture. Salk, yes, Salk is one of those absolutely extraordinary spaces. But when it comes to architectural detail, I was so hoping we'd get onto concrete, because one of the things that makes that so extraordinary is the actual detailing of the concrete, which is not detailing, it's revealing the big idea, and the handling of it in relation to travertine, water, steel, and wood. And so what I wanted to suggest as a possible reflection for the future would be material, immaterial. Material, immaterial. In other words, the concrete realization of things in the world, but the more abstract and metaphysical dimension of architecture and the way these two things can or cannot come together. So those are my thoughts. But thank you very much, everybody, for all your enriching observations and discussions.
Thank you, William. Priyanka and Naomi.
Thank you, Wilfried, for giving us this opportunity to be able to present here. And we also really like the summation of all the points in the end. I think it's something, there's a lot that we are also taking back. And we really appreciate the kind of questions and comments that came about post the presentation. And I think in the chat box, Trenton and Carlos rightly identified certain things. We do acknowledge that looking at a building and placing it in time is extremely important. And while there are some aspects which change with time, there are still certain aspects which don't change. So, for example, in the case of Kanchenjunga, even though it might have responded to the critique, the building was made in critique to other buildings of that time, it still did not cater to certain things like climate, which over a long period of time has still remained the same. So those problems, the issues haven't really changed. How our buildings interact with the local climate and the local context haven't changed. And while maybe the addition of shops at a later stage was something which happened, like Professor Rahul mentioned, as an addition, or could be looked at as a temporal component to the building, the other parts of the analysis still remain pertinent even in that time and even during this time. So this is just what we wanted to add.
But thank you so much, everybody, for all your insights. They were really helpful to us.
Thank you, Priyanka, and thank you, Naomi. I think it's encouraging to have the younger generation, if I may say that, participate at such eloquent and intellectually focused way. It gives us a lot of hope that things, even though we are in a deep crisis at various levels, that there are next generations of thinkers and architects who are willing to persist and insist and hold their ground. And I'd like to encourage you to continue to think and participate in all sorts of different ways. Because this event and the idea of submission of abstracts to be selected is intended to foster the next generation. Thank you. Trent.
Thank you. And thank you so much to everyone who's presented, for Wilfred for summing things up so wonderfully, for all the presentations today. They were really incredible. It's been incredible to be a part, as always. And if I can organize my thoughts, something that's come up a number of times quite consistently throughout the conference this year, and that what Eric was saying just a moment ago brought to mind again, is a friction we've come against seemingly in every discussion, is this supposed conflict or friction between temporal ideas of, or temporal conceptions of beauty, aesthetics, the dissection of aesthetics and content, function, ethics, use. And I would contend that a lot of those frictions would be resolved if we reframed our view of aesthetics and beauty in much the way that you were arguing so eloquently, Eric, as relational content and as ontological qualities rather than purely visual qualities. Aesthetics are not purely visual, and neither is beauty. One can point to Mass Design Group saying justice is beauty, beauty is justice, or Alvaro Siza, the peak of function is beauty, beauty is the peak of function. So I think that's just something I'd like to throw into the ring for consideration for possible future conferences, and also just wanted to raise the question again more explicitly of how do we move forward from here productively? I think this has been a wonderful conference, and how should we change what we're doing? What should we do next?
Thank you, Trent, for allowing us to introduce the final part of this discussion, if I may. Possible topics of future conferences. We've had, I think I've noted 4. Elias mentioned the architectural flux, if I've correctly noted that. Previously, or Trent, you've just talked about again the aesthetics and ethics of architecture. Previously, we talked about architecture as built criticism. And I think we could make that issue a little bit more specific, given the differentiation that the discussion between Rahul and Priyanka and Naomi brought up. And I think William just mentioned the material and the immaterial aspects of architecture. So I don't know how we should deal with this, but I think it might be useful maybe to discuss this a little bit right now, and but not to necessarily come to a conclusion, but to say we invite comments by email, and then we'll try and come up with a topic that has most support as a way of saying that's the next step forward. I must say, I find this online format absolutely brilliant. I know that many people prefer real presence for obvious reasons, because there are so many more dimensions to meeting people. However, we cannot, in this age of climate change, and certainly not in the economic situation that most people are in and institutions are in, afford to fly people across the globe. And the fact that we've had presentations from Asia to the Americas proves that such a format can work if we concentrate our meetings around these times. We can share our presences virtually. And I do find that this format, then coupled with the production of a book, is certainly one of the most energetic and efficient ways of gathering all sorts of people and allowing people to speak. Also, if I may say so, in a very civilized manner, without people interfering and chit chat and so on. So I'd like to thank everybody, first of all, for participating and asking questions and making comments, but also for taking on this next phase, maybe, of thinking about potential topics. And so we have some time. We can discuss this. So if anybody would like to make a comment or ask further questions, please do so. Elias.
Yes, thank you very much, Wilfred, also for the attempt, which I would have found very difficult, to condense these 4 days talking about quality. I was very close to what Jasna said when she started today, and said that it's a very open context. So I think it's easier to point to quality very often, like Wittgenstein says, than to talk about it. So I very much appreciate that. Now, just a couple of words that explain why I thought the subtitle of Raul's talk today was very pertinent. Architecture in a time of flux. One may think that many periods, even in recent history, are transitional in a time of flux. So one might even improve it, saying architecture in the context of time. Now, I'm saying this because I think over the last century, we've been troubled a lot, oscillating between permanence and change, from the early futurist manifestos to high tech, today's ephemeral concerns. The idea of change seems to be very important. On the other hand, permanence, lasting in time, is a characteristic of architecture. How do we discuss this? How do we bring them together? It's not a matter of being up to date and talking about major issues of today, which are not the machine, but it's sustainability. But it's to do very much, let's say, with the presentations we heard today. Even in your scheme, moving from base properties to core properties, and then to aspirational ones, I think base and core properties share concerns about space, time, place, program, climate, whatever. But when you move to aspirational properties, I think there one transcends place and time. Place doesn't change, but the context of place changes. So program, place, and time especially is superseded. So I think the temporal dimension is very important. Now, if we pin it more specifically to architecture in a time of flux, that might be an idea. But of course, I'm open to all the other suggestions. I just want to make these clarifications.
Thank you, Elias. Kevin.
Hi, thanks, Wilfred. I was thinking the topics that you propose for next year sound really good, but there might be confusion still, because then we'd have a lot of papers that talk about both of those things, but then make the mistake or not of confusing what aesthetics are and what ethics are. And maybe we could have a conference purely on aesthetics to define what it means to each one of us. and then we could then have a better basic, because I think it's clear the immaterial that William refers to, having to do with ethics or intangibles or content, critical content, and aesthetics. You know, it's such a slippery ground. So maybe we could just have a conference defining what aesthetics means.
Well, Kevin,
I'm
glad that you brought this up, because had I just put aesthetics of architecture, I think you would have said, "Oh, wait a minute, what about the ethics of architecture?" So I
I wouldn't have. I wouldn't. It depends how you frame it. If you had just gone aesthetics defined.
Yes, no, all good. Thank you, Kevin.
Okay. No.
Rahul.
Thank you, Wilfred. No, I just want to pick up on what Elias said. However much I like the idea of architecture in flux, in a time of flux, I think his reframing of it within the question of time, I think could be very productive, because if, one is we haven't paid enough, whether it's in planning or urban design, I think landscape architecture by default implicitly encodes time in its imaginary, but architecture, urban planning, and urban design have not. And I think to interrogate the notion of time in architecture could be very productive. In fact, all the other titles that you listed, including what was just brought up, ethics and aesthetics, material, immaterial, they all roll very beautifully into the rubric of time, to interrogate time. I just want to refer back to my own presentation and the discussion after that. And one question stayed with me, which I couldn't respond, and it's related to this notion of time, which is, I think I was asked, should we as architects in projects like the Elephant Village just say, no, we won't take this on? So I can read that as academic grandstanding, because in the academics, you can do that very easily, or interrogate it. And I think for me, time was very important in understanding that, ethics and aesthetics, all of that, because I think and that's why I use that quotation from Pratap Bhanu Mehta, which is, there is no moral value in not acting in a question like that. If in the CEPT library, I was told they don't agree to me going below the ground and respecting the datum, I tell you honestly, sincerely, I would not have taken that job on, because I knew that the materiality, the permanence implied there in terms of the time durée was much stronger. Whereas in the Elephant Village, I really saw that as a transitionary problem, where it was about making a landscape. The politics around whether the elephants were free or not in the future, I see that in the future becoming a 15-acre park for Jaipur, and the elephants will roam free. I aspire to that, right? So I think if you bring time, if we find ways of bringing time into our imaginary of architecture and placemaking, the built phenomena, as you call it, Wilfred, I think that is something the profession desperately needs.
Thank you, Rahul. So we have two colleagues who are very much behind this topic, and Jasna and then Eric.
Thank you. I was just, I wanted to pose a question to Professor Rahul Malhotra, but due to the lack of time, I did not, but the temporality or the aspect of time and change and ethics is perhaps, as was said immediately before, the overarching topic that could be, I guess, covering what could be the topic of the next conference.
So how would you formulate it?
Transition. So following the Eve Blau and her transition as condition as something that could be the common ground for the debate that could be enough provocative and challenging for considering the debate about ethical aspects and change, what architecture's new possible social role could be, or ethos.
Yeah, so okay. Bernard Girl has written, and she suggested that wouldn't we think that the dichotomy of material versus immaterial in architectural criticism also encapsulates debates around aesthetics, ethics, and aspirations, temporality, and so on. Of course, there's so many intersections around all these topics. The key issues are also related to how do we attract attention by colleagues and future participants of this conference to submit abstracts. And so these topics must not be too hermetic, and they should be as open and as inspirational as possible. Eric.
Sure. For me, a word that encapsulates a lot of these issues is also the word ecology. The idea of something ecological has an association now with, sustainability and energy, things like that. But really, at its core, it means something much more. It thinks about the object of study as embedded within larger systems and something through which other things flow and exchanges between the object and its environment. And I think, it accounts for time, and a lot of these other issues too. So it could be useful to pose that. It's also a provocative term, saying something like ecologies of everything or something along those terms.
Thank you, Eric. Are there any, Jean?
Yeah, I'd like to extend what Eric said. I think this is, if we take the question of quality in that sense, for instance, classical architecture, there was like a fixed notion of quality that you basically took that reference and you reproduce it. In modernism, you had some dogmas also, which were fixed on the stereotypes of aestheticism and so on. And I think what this notion of ecology, what Eric says, for me, destroys all of that, because there is no standard anymore, and you can't rely on one fixed dogma or anything. If you want to do good buildings nowadays, from what I heard in this conference, it's all about articulation of the context, and something that emerges out of it is how you arrange and make things work within the system, which in every context is different.
Thank you, Rahul.
Yeah, just very quickly, just to expand somebody, the comment, sorry, that referred to Eve Blau in transitions. I mean, I think a beautiful way she describes it, which has implications on the built phenomena, is she says transitions aren't clean. You don't transition overnight out of communism into capitalism. Transitions happen simultaneously, and sometimes they overlap for decades. And that's the model we see in the built environment today. So I just wanted to expand on that.
Thank you. Fernando.
I just wanted to share with you that I was reminded by the conversation of the temporal, the transitional of time, that permanence is not more than an illusion, as Hannah Arendt famously quoted, that the way to create the illusion of permanence. And the problem of ecology is that we must deal with the temporary. We must think from cradle to cradle. So this think like a process. And yes, I think I don't know how to define it, but all these words converge to this problem.
Thank you, Fernando. I think there are different lifespans to all these things. There are different times that certain transitions take. As Rahul has just referred to Eve Blau's comment on transitions from communism to capitalism. Sometimes these things happen faster in certain areas of a society than others. The mindset of some of the bureaucrats and the power structures are outlast political systems and embed themselves in capitalist structures. I think the important thing in this discussion is how do we make a significant contribution to the field of knowledge that is not restrictive on the one hand, because when we talk about quality in architecture, I see alarm bells going off and saying, oh, well, you know, are these guys trying to define finally a kind of a quantitative assessment system of quality? We certainly are not. And I think this conference has shown that we have opened the spectrum and that we have illuminated a number of different points of view. And I think the same would be true of future conferences. So while on the one hand, we don't want to fall into this rationalistic, mechanistic, quantifiable realm of ways of thinking, on the other hand, we do have the aspiration to become precise in the way that we understand certain phenomena so that we can share ways by which we talk about architecture, because that's one of the problems that we've had in every part of the world. For example, in Germany, there are societies, there is a society called the German Society for Sustainable Building, DGNB. And they have a catalog of how to assess a sustainable building. And it includes the category of quality. However, there's no entry in the category of quality because they have not been able to agree on how to assess quality, right? So this is a big gap in an approach. I mean, the Germans always want to be completely systematic, and you know, they know that there is such a thing as quality in architecture, but nobody dares to talk about quality in architecture, right? So this is a big lacuna, and then, you know, your mind boggles how why did they even bother to include the category of quality if they're unable to speak about it, right? So this is why we should not, and when I say we, I presume that I'm talking for the majority of us, we are not interested in the quantification of quality. To make that absolutely certain, we're interested in the precise discussion about qualities so that we can center this discussion back into the discourse of architecture, or back into the discourse of the built phenomenon. And because otherwise it will get occupied by those who are interested in, you know, awarding brownie points, awarding silver lead points to these kinds of things, right? And that's why I think our efforts are important, also in the publication of the proceedings of the conference, in making this particular voice heard in the big field of publications. I would like to suggest, because we need to come to the close, we have colleagues from Asia who need to go to bed because tomorrow is Monday. I would like to encourage you to send us messages via email. And I would like to encourage you to also think about not relying on Jose Manuel and myself to organize these events all the time, but to also share in the organization so that we can spread the responsibilities and ultimately pass on, maybe in a couple of years' time, the baton to the next generations of people interested in this particular form of interchange. So do all consider that you're now part of a kind of a growing community of people interested in this topic around architecture. And I hope that those who presented papers will develop the papers and finalize them and submit them for publication. And for those who are interested in joining, for those who are interested in defining the next topic, please write to us and contribute in this way to the formation and the continuity of the conference. I'd like to thank my colleague Jasna for co-chairing. I'd like to thank Rahul for his brilliant presentation, spirited and energetic, and Eric for your very insightful and also absolutely wonderfully concise and condensed compilation of thoughts that no doubt many years of work has been reduced to 20 minutes. There are so many things that I'd like to discuss with you about, but we didn't have time. It was a little bit unfair that you are the pig in the middle, that Priyanka and Naomi had more time to answer questions, but that's how the cookie crumbles, as they say in England. Priyanka and Naomi, thank you for your presentation. Thank you to the scientific committee, and thank you to the audience for your attention and for your participation. I don't want to have the last word. If anybody would like to say something more, please do.
Well done, Wilfred.
I would just like to, I would just like to thank you, Wilfred. Thank you for believing in me that I will be able to co-chair the session. And thank you all for having me here, having the opportunity to share this wonderful exchange of experience and thought with you. So hope to meet you on the next conference.
Thank you, Jasna.
See you all someplace.
See you all next year.
Thank you, Louise.
Bye.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Have a great Sunday.
Bye.